She had 24 hours to find a husband or lose everything her father ever built. Not a metaphor, not an exaggeration. 24 hours. One man, one impossible choice. Adriana Okoye, 26 years old, dead on her feet, 3,000 miles from home, whispered those words into a back hallway in Seoul thinking nobody could hear her. She was wrong, because sitting 12 feet away, behind a closed door, was Kang Jiheon, the most feared syndicate boss in South Korea, a man who hadn't offered kindness to anyone in over a decade. He heard every word, and he had a proposal she couldn't refuse. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. Jitid. The rain that night came down like it had a personal grudge against Seoul, not the soft, cinematic kind of rain that looked pretty on rooftops and made people feel poetic about their lives. This was the brutal, bone-soaking kind. The kind that drove sideways through alleys and found every gap in every collar and made the city feel smaller and meaner than it already was. The streets outside Gumong restaurant ran black with pooled water under neon signs that bled red and gold across the pavement, and the thunder that rolled through the Han River district shook the kitchen windows hard enough to rattle the plates on their hooks. Adriana Okoye felt none of it. She was already soaked through from the inside. She moved through the kitchen on autopilot, left hand balancing a tray of empty glasses, right hand already reaching for the next order ticket before the first one was filed. Her shoes were half a size too small, bought cheap from a market stall near her apartment building 3 months ago, and by the end of every shift her toes went numb in a way that she'd stopped bothering to worry about. Pain had a shelf life. You either adapted or you didn't. Adriana had adapted to so many things in the past 2 years that some mornings she barely recognized herself in the bathroom mirror above the sink. "Table 9 is waiting on the salmon," Chef Park said without looking up from the pass. "Already plated," she answered without breaking stride. "The Japanese businessman in room 2 wants the wine list again. I brought it 11 minutes ago. He's stalling because he wants company, not wine. Tell him we close at 11. Chef Park finally looked up. 42 years old, weathered in the specific way that Korean restaurant kitchens weathered people. Permanently exhausted, but permanently functional. He gave her a look that was almost respect and said nothing else. Adriana pushed through the swing door and entered the dining room. Gumong was the kind of restaurant that didn't advertise. You knew about it or you didn't, and if you had to ask the price of anything, you couldn't afford to be there. 3 floors, private dining rooms on the upper level, a ground floor of white tablecloths and hushed conversation, and people who made decisions over dinner that other people spent their whole careers trying to understand. The food was technically Korean, but operated in that rarefied territory where cuisine stopped being about hunger and started being about performance. Adriana had worked here for 14 months. She was the only black woman on the floor staff. She was aware of this every single shift, the same way she was aware of the weight of her tray. Not constantly, not consciously, but always present at the edge of things. A low-grade friction she'd learned to move around rather than through. She served table 9 without ceremony. Smiled at the businessman in room 2 with the kind of smile that communicated warmth and absolutely no availability. Handled a complaint from a woman in a couture dress who claimed her soup was half a degree too cool with the same calm she applied to everything. Patient, efficient, invisible in the way that good service always was. By 9:40, she was running on 4 hours of sleep and the particular kind of adrenaline that came from necessity rather than energy. By 10:15, she was in the back hallway. The back hallway at Gumong was a narrow service corridor that ran between the main kitchen and the private dining wing. Staff used it to move between floors without crossing the dining room floor. It smelled like garlic and industrial cleaner and the specific dampness of a building that had been breathing the same air for 30 years. A single fluorescent tube flickered at the far end near the fire exit, throwing the corridor into uncertain light. Adriana stood against the wall with her back flat to the plaster and her tray tucked under her arm and her phone pressed to her ear. The call had come in at 10:12, her sister's name on the screen. Chisholm. 19 years old, second year at university in Lagos, the brightest of the 4 Okoye girls and the one who had inherited their father's terrifying ability to stay composed while delivering catastrophic news. Adri. That was how Chisholm started. Not hello. Not sorry to call so late. Just her name, 2 syllables, which somehow communicated everything that was about to follow. Adriana pressed herself harder against the wall. Tell me. Uncle Emeka's lawyer called the house today. Her stomach dropped 4 floors. Chisholm. He says Dad's will has a clause. We missed it. The solicitor didn't catch it when they first filed the probate. Adriana closed her eyes. Her father, Dr. Tobena Okoye, cardiologist, stubborn traditionalist, dead 2 years and still somehow managing to make her life complicated from the grave, had written his will during a period when his own father's outdated ideas about female inheritance were fresh in his mind. He'd meant it as protection, a structure, something to keep her uncle's hands off the family assets until Adriana was settled and established enough to manage them properly. What clause? She said. Her voice was flat. It was the voice she used when she needed to stay functional and couldn't afford to feel anything yet. The inheritance transfers entirely to you on your 27th birthday. The house, the land in Enugu, the accounts, everything. I know that part. There's a condition attached to the transfer. Chisholm paused, and in that pause, Adriana felt the specific quality of dread that only family could manufacture. Dad added a clause that the transfer is conditional on you being legally married at the time of inheritance. If you're not married, stop. Everything passes to Uncle Emeka as next of kin. The fluorescent light at the end of the hallway flickered twice. Adriana stared at it. That's not legal, she said. That can't be enforceable. The lawyer confirmed it. Nigerian family court upheld clauses like this 3 times in the last decade. Dad's solicitor is mortified. He says he should have flagged it during the original filing, but the language was buried in subsection. Chisholm's voice cracked just slightly. Audrey, your birthday is tomorrow. Tomorrow. Midnight tomorrow. Adriana did the math without wanting to. 12 hours difference between Seoul and Lagos. Her birthday began at midnight Seoul time, which meant 14 hours, she said quietly. I have 14 hours. I know. And if Emeka gets the estate, he'll sell the house within a month. Chisholm didn't sugarcoat it. Their uncle had been trying to liquidate their father's assets since the funeral. The land in Enugu had developers circling it. The house in Lagos, the house where all 4 girls had grown up, where their mother had died, where their father had sat in his study every evening reading cardiology journals with his reading glasses pushed down his nose, was worth considerable money to the right buyer. Uncle Emeka had the right buyer already waiting. My tuition for next year, Ngozi's, the twins' school fees. It all runs through the estate, Audrey. If he gets control, I know what it means. Her voice came out harder than she intended. She softened it. I know. I'm thinking. She was not thinking. She was barely breathing. There was a beat of silence across the 3,000 miles between them. Is there anyone? Chisholm asked carefully. Anyone you could... I'm in Seoul, Chi. I work 14-hour shifts at a restaurant. My social life is non-existent. She stopped herself before she said anything else that would make her younger sister feel guilty for making the call. I'm going to figure it out. Don't tell the twins anything yet. Tell Ngozi to stay calm. Audrey, I'll call you back. She hung up. The hallway was very quiet. The kitchen noise filtered through the walls as a low, muffled roar, heat and metal and voices, and the sound of a service running at full capacity. Somewhere above her in the private dining wing, a man was laughing. The laugh was the practiced, expansive kind that wealthy men deployed at other wealthy men to demonstrate that everything was fine and comfortable and exactly as it should be. Adriana stood in the flickering corridor and felt the full weight of everything pressing down on her at once. She'd come to Seoul 2 years ago with a plan that felt reasonable at the time. Work high-end hospitality for 3 years, save aggressively, build credentials, go home with enough capital to establish herself independently of the family dynamics that had been slowly strangling her since her father got sick. She'd been good at the plan. She sent money home every month. Chisholm's tuition, Ngozi's medicine, the twins' school fees, household expenses for their aunt who looked after them. She ate modestly and lived modestly and wore shoes half a size too small and told herself it was temporary. She had not accounted for her father's will. She had not accounted for the fact that Tobena Okoye, even dead, would find a way to make his oldest daughter's life contingent on a decision she hadn't made yet. The tears that hit her were the furious kind, not the grief kind. She didn't wipe them immediately because she was too tired and too angry to bother, and in the flickering light of the back hallway of Gumong Restaurant, 26 years old and 14 hours from losing everything, Adriana Okoye said the sentence out loud purely because it needed to be said somewhere. I have 24 hours to find a husband. She said it to the wall, to the flickering light, to the general injustice of the situation. She did not say it to anyone in particular, but the private dining rooms on this level had walls that were thinner than the architects who designed them had intended, and the door to private dining room 3 was not entirely closed. She found this out 40 seconds later. Tisk. The door opened without warning, not aggressively, not violently. It simply opened smoothly and deliberately, and the man who stepped into the hallway filled it so completely that the corridor seemed to get smaller the moment he appeared in it. Kang Jiheon was 34 years old. He was tall in the way that certain Korean men carried height, not imposing through bulk, but through a quality of stillness that made the space around him feel charged. He was wearing a black suit that had clearly been made specifically for his body rather than bought from a rack, and the jacket was unbuttoned and his tie was loosened exactly 1 inch, in a way that felt deliberate rather than casual. His face was the kind of face that Seoul's financial press had been running in profile pieces for 3 years. Angular, controlled, with eyes that were dark enough and still enough that looking directly into them for too long made most people instinctively look away. Most people. Adriana was too tired and too angry and too emotionally detonated to manage a tactical retreat. She stared at him straight on and felt nothing except the particular exhaustion of someone who had simply run out of capacity to be intimidated by one more thing. She knew who he was. Everyone who worked at Gumong knew who Kang Jiheon was. He had a standing reservation for private dining room 3. Every Thursday evening, 6 to 10 p.m., rotating guest list of men whose names appeared in financial news and occasionally in crime beat coverage that was always careful and always vague. He tipped exactly 20% every time, no more and no less, which the other staff found cold and which Adriana had always found simply precise. He had never been rude to her. He had never been particularly warm either. He was a man who occupied space without apologizing for it and expected the world to arrange itself accordingly. She had served him and his guests for 14 months. He had never once acknowledged that she was a specific human being rather than a function. Until now. He looked at her in the flickering corridor with an expression that was entirely unreadable, and he said nothing for a long moment, and Adriana, who was holding the shredded remains of her composure together with both hands, said, "Mr. Kang, I apologize for the noise. I'll be back on the floor." She moved to step around him. "You weren't loud," he said. His voice was low. It had the quality of something that didn't need volume to carry. She stopped. "I wasn't aware the rooms shared a wall so closely," she said carefully. "If you overheard something, 24 hours, he said. "Just that." She went very still. He wasn't mocking her. That was the thing she clocked first, scanning his face for condescension and finding none. He was watching her with the focused attention of someone taking inventory, not of her appearance, but of something else, something harder to name. "That's a private matter," she said. Her voice didn't shake. She was proud of that. It sounded like it. "Then you understand why I need to get back to work. You're planning to leave at 11. At 11, yes. Which gives me—" She checked her watch. A small cheap thing with a cracked face that she'd been meaning to replace for 8 months. 47 minutes of this shift left, and I'd prefer to spend them doing my job rather than— "Sit down," he said. The flat certainty of it stopped her mid-sentence. "Excuse me? There's a bench at the end of the corridor. Sit down for 5 minutes. He paused. "Please." The please landed oddly, like a word he didn't use often enough to deploy naturally, but was making the effort with anyway. Adriana studied him for a moment. The stillness, the dark eyes, the complete absence of any readable agenda, and made the calculation that a man like Kang Jiheon did not make requests without reasons, and that whatever his reason was, she was curious enough and desperate enough that sitting down for 5 minutes cost her nothing. She wasn't already losing. She sat on the wooden bench at the end of the corridor. He sat beside her, leaving 8 inches of space between them, and set his elbows on his knees and looked at the opposite wall. The way men looked at things when they were thinking about something they hadn't entirely finished thinking about yet. The kitchen noise moved through the walls around them. After 30 seconds, he said, "Explain the situation." "I don't think that's not for my benefit." He still wasn't looking at her. "Because you're holding it together on adrenaline right now, and the moment you have to say it out loud coherently, you'll figure out whether there's actually a solution or whether there isn't." Adriana looked at the side of his face. He was right. The logic was completely correct, and she resented it. She talked, flatly, efficiently, the way she did everything. The will, the clause, the birthday at midnight, her uncle, the house, her sisters, the math of what happened if Amika got control of the estate. She left out the part about her shoes being too small and the part where she'd been crying 40 seconds before he opened the door, because those details were hers and she wasn't giving them to anyone. When she finished, the corridor was quiet. Jiheon sat with it for a moment. Then he said, "What are your requirements for the marriage to be legally valid under Nigerian inheritance law?" She blinked. "What?" "The clause specifies legal marriage. What constitutes that under the applicable law?" A civil registration, witnessed and filed." She had thought about this on the phone with Chisholm briefly before her brain had shunted away from it because the answer was so impossible it wasn't worth completing. In Nigeria, it would be a registry office. But even if I could get a marriage registered in Nigeria before midnight, I'd have to physically international marriage registration between South Korea and Nigeria. It's legally recognized under bilateral civil agreements if properly filed through the relevant consulate. I have a lawyer who specializes in this. He said it with the flat calm of someone reading a procedure manual, not proposing something extraordinary. The consulate can file emergency documentation. It's been done within 8 hours with the right contacts. Adriana stared at him. "You know this," she said slowly. "Because..." He finally looked at her. "Because I've had reason to understand international legal frameworks for formal agreements." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." The light at the end of the corridor had stopped flickering. The kitchen sounds continued their muffled roar. Adriana was aware of her own heartbeat in an uncomfortable, too loud way. "What do you want?" she asked. Her voice came out very direct. There was no point in being anything else. "Because men like you don't sit in service corridors offering legal solutions to waitresses out of charity. So what is it that you actually want?" Something shifted in his expression. Not softness exactly, more like recognition. The specific look of someone who was tired of people pretending not to notice what was obviously happening and who appreciated being spoken to directly for once. "My grandmother," he said, "Kang Hana. She's 78 years old. She's been ill for 4 months." He looked back at the wall. "She raised me after my parents died. She is the only person I have left who I..." He stopped, started again differently. "She's asked me repeatedly for the last 2 years to marry. Not because of tradition, because she's afraid of what happens to me after she's gone if I'm still alone." Adriana said nothing. "She's getting worse faster than the doctors initially projected. She has months, maybe less. She knows the marriage I've been promising her hasn't happened, and she knows why it hasn't happened, and she stopped pushing because she loves me enough to stop pushing, but..." He paused again, in the particular way people paused when they were saying something that cost them something to say. "I can't give her nothing. I'm asking for 6 months. A legal marriage, public enough to be credible, with whatever terms protect you completely. At the end of 6 months, a clean divorce, full financial settlement. My attorney will draft whatever you need." The bench was hard under her. The hallway smelled like garlic and old plaster. Adriana heard everything he said and sat with it, and did not rush to respond because she was 26 years old and exhausted and very frightened, and she needed to think clearly, even though thinking clearly was the hardest thing she'd done in months. "Why me?" she said. "Because you're here." That's not enough of an answer. He looked at her again, directly this time. "Because I've watched you work for 14 months, and you are the least performative person I have ever encountered in any room. You don't pretend. You don't smile when something isn't funny. You don't make yourself smaller to make other people comfortable." He paused. "My grandmother would see through anyone I brought to her who was playing a part. She's been seeing through people for 78 years. She needs to believe it's real." Another pause. Shorter. "With you, she'd have reason to." Adriana looked at her hands in her lap. The right one had a small burn scar from a kitchen accident 3 weeks ago. The left one had a hangnail she hadn't dealt with because she'd been too busy. "I need to call my sister," she said. Of course. I need a lawyer to review any contract before I sign anything. I'll have my attorney available within the hour. I need the terms in writing. Everything. The timeline, the finances, the conditions. If I'm in your world for 6 months, I need to know exactly what that means and exactly what happens at the end. That's reasonable. And I need one more thing. He waited. My family, my sisters, their education, the house in Lagos. If I'm doing this to protect those things, I need them protected properly, not just the immediate transfer. I need them secured in a way that my uncle can't circle back and find another angle. The pause this time was different. She couldn't read what was in it. I can make that happen, he said. I need it in the contract. I understand. She stood up, smoothed her apron. She had 23 minutes of her shift left and she was going to work them because she was not the kind of person who abandoned a shift for personal circumstances, and also because she needed the 23 minutes to decide whether she was actually about to do this or whether she was going to spend the rest of her life wondering what would have happened if she'd said yes. She turned and looked at him where he sat still and even on the corridor bench, and she said the most honest thing she'd said to anyone in 2 years in Seoul. I don't trust you. I don't know you, but I don't have anything else. She took a breath. Give me 20 minutes to finish my shift. Then I'll come to room 3 and hear the terms. He nodded once, the nod of someone who had expected exactly this answer. She pushed through the swing door back into the kitchen and picked up the next order ticket and kept moving. Woke up. 41 minutes later, she sat across from Kang Jiheon in private dining room 3. The room had the same quiet that all expensive rooms had, the particular hush of insulation and money working together to keep the chaos of the actual world at a distance. A half-finished bottle of wine sat on the table that Jiheon's earlier guests had left. Someone had arranged the chairs back correctly. The overhead lighting was low and amber. His attorney had arrived in 12 minutes, which told her something about the kind of world she was stepping into. The man's name was Attorney Han Seo-jun, 50s, spectacled, the deeply professional manner of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by anything his client asked him to arrange. He had a tablet and a briefcase, and he laid the initial contract framework on the table with the efficiency of a surgeon prepping instruments. Adriana read every word. She asked 12 questions. Han answered 11 of them immediately and checked with Jiheon on the 12th. She asked for 3 modifications to the financial terms, 2 of which Han granted immediately, and 1 of which required a 5-minute private conversation between attorney and client that she sat through in complete silence, watching the window and the rain still working itself against the glass. The modification was granted. The section about her family was longer than she expected and more comprehensive. She read it twice, then a third time. It had the specific quality of something that had been drafted not to satisfy a request but to actually solve a problem, and she sat with that for a moment, with the strange weight of having her actual concern taken seriously rather than managed. She signed at 11:58 p.m. Jiheon signed without reading it. She noticed this. He caught her noticing. I had him draft it to your specifications, he said simply. There's nothing in there that wasn't what you asked for. Most people still read things before they sign them. Most people need to. He capped the pen and set it on the table. I trust Han's precision. You trust him, but you're not sure you trust me. I'm not sure you trust me either. I don't, she confirmed. He looked at her with something in his face that wasn't quite a smile, but occupied the same general territory. Then we're starting honestly. That's more than most people manage. Han Seo-jun gathered the documents with the movements of a man who had witnessed many unusual things and had learned to process them as procedural rather than remarkable. He told them the consulate filing would begin at 7 a.m. and that the legal registration could be confirmed by early afternoon the following day, pending standard documentation from Adriana's passport and residency papers. She had 14 hours to spare. When Han left, the room was very quiet. Adriana sat with the empty chair where the attorney had been and looked at the man across the table and understood for the first time the full reality of what she'd just done. The rain was still hitting the windows. Seoul was still enormous and indifferent outside. You should sleep, Jiheon said. There will be paperwork in the morning, and you've been awake for... He checked his watch. At least 18 hours, if your shift started at 2. 4, she said. I started at 4. Then 20 hours. Sleep. He stood, straightened his jacket. The mask was back, the complete composed surface that didn't show anything he hadn't decided to show. My driver will take you to your apartment. Tomorrow morning, someone will come to bring you to the consulate. I can take the subway. It's 1 a.m. and it's raining. I've done it before. You've done many things you didn't need to do, he said. There was no judgment in it. Almost something else, something that arrived and departed too quickly to name. Let the driver take you. She stood, gathered her coat from the chair where she'd left it. She was aware of how she looked, end of shift, tired, wearing restaurant uniform and shoes that didn't fit, and felt no particular embarrassment about it because this was who she was, and if Kang Jiheon had any issue with it, he should have looked for someone else in a different hallway. At the door, she stopped. The restaurant, she said, Gumong, my job. This doesn't... I'll handle the schedule with Chef Park. I don't want special treatment. I still want to work my... Adriana. He said her name for the first time. She'd been wondering if he knew it. Of course he knew it. He'd been reading her employee file, presumably, but hearing it in his voice was different. It had weight. The terms protect your independence completely. You keep working. You keep every arrangement you have. The marriage is a legal framework. Nothing changes about your life except what needs to change. She looked at him for a moment longer than was necessary. Go sleep, he said. She left. The driver was waiting exactly where Jiheon said he would be. A black car at the curb, engine running. A man in his 40s who opened the door without ceremony and drove her the 22 minutes to her apartment building without speaking, which she appreciated more than she could articulate. She sat in the back seat and watched Seoul move past the windows. The rain had softened to a drizzle. The city at 1 a.m. had a different quality than the city at any other hour. The neon thinner, the streets emptier, the scale of it slightly less aggressive. She'd loved this city in the beginning, hated it in months 3 through 7 when the loneliness was worst, and arrived somewhere past both in the months since. Seoul was where she was. It wasn't home. She'd stopped expecting it to become home. Her phone buzzed. Chisholm. She answered. Tell me, her sister said immediately. I handled it. Silence. Audrey, what does that mean? It means I handled it. The inheritance will transfer correctly. The estate is protected. She paused. I'll explain everything when it's finalized. Don't tell the twins yet. Tell Ngozi to stop worrying. Another silence, longer this time, with a quality that Chisholm, who had known her since she was born, deployed specifically when she suspected something Adriana wasn't saying. Are you okay? Chisholm asked. I'm tired. That's not what I asked. I know. Adriana watched a delivery truck move through a red light in the rain, slow and deliberate. I'll be okay. I'll call you tomorrow. She hung up before her sister could ask anything else. In her apartment, small, the walls slightly too thin, a kitchen that got excellent light in the mornings, she didn't sleep immediately. She sat at her kitchen table with a glass of water and her phone turned face down and thought about the signed contract in Han Seo-jun's briefcase, and the man she'd left in private dining room 3, and the moment 3 hours ago when she'd been alone in a flickering corridor thinking there was no possible solution to an impossible problem. She thought about his face when he said my grandmother. The way the controlled surface had almost broken on those 2 words. The way he'd started the sentence and then reconstructed it into something less exposed. The fraction of a second when he'd been a person rather than a persona. She thought about the fact that she didn't trust him. She thought about the fact that she'd signed anyway. In the morning, the sun came up gray and cool over Seoul, and Adriana showered and dressed in the best clothes she owned. A dark blue blouse and black trousers that she'd bought for a job interview 8 months ago and never worn since, and drank her coffee standing at the kitchen window watching the city come alive, and told herself this was a transaction, a legal arrangement between 2 people who needed specific things from each other. Nothing mysterious about it, nothing to be frightened of. At 7:52 a.m., a black car appeared at the curb outside her building. She picked up her bag, her passport, and the folder of documents Han had requested the night before. She'd found most of them in her small, fireproof box. The box she kept everything that mattered in. The box she'd carried from Lagos to Seoul and moved to every apartment she'd lived in since. She walked downstairs. The driver held the door open without speaking. She got in. The car pulled away from the curb, and she watched her apartment building shrink in the rear window. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she heard her own voice in the flickering corridor. I have 24 hours to find a husband, and understood with a cold clarity that the next 6 months of her life had just begun. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, sitting in the back of that black car in the gray Seoul morning with her documents in her lap and her heart locked down behind 6 layers of practical thinking, was that the agreement she'd signed the night before was going to cost her something that no contract could quantify, and that the most dangerous man in Seoul was already, in the precise and careful way of a man who dealt in control and power and the management of everything around him, beginning to unravel. Not because of his grandmother, not because of the contract, because of her. But she didn't know that yet. The car moved through the Seoul traffic, and the city went on being enormous and indifferent around her. And somewhere in a penthouse above the Han River, a man who had not slept was standing at a floor-to-ceiling window, looking at the same gray morning sky, and thinking about a woman in a flickering corridor who had looked at him without flinching and told him plainly and without performance that she didn't trust him. He was still thinking about it when the sun fully cleared the horizon. That was the thing no one who knew Kang Jiheon would have believed if they'd seen it. The most feared man in Seoul, standing at a window, dawn light across his face, turning over the memory of a woman telling him exactly what she thought of him, and finding, to his own considerable bewilderment, that it was the most honest thing anyone had said to him in years. She arrived at the consulate thinking this was the beginning of a transaction. She had no idea it was the beginning of something she wouldn't survive walking away from. The consulate smelled like bureaucracy and fluorescent lighting, and the particular brand of institutional patience that made Adriana's jaw tighten the moment she walked through the door. Han Seojin was already there when she arrived, standing near the reception desk in a charcoal suit, tablet in hand, looking like a man who had been awake for hours and found this entirely unremarkable. He gave her a brief nod that communicated, "Good morning, we have work to do," and nothing else, which she appreciated. Jiheon was not there. She noticed this before she noticed anything else about the room, which irritated her. "Mr. Kang sends his apologies," Han said, reading her face with the efficiency of someone who had spent years translating his clients' absences to other people. "He had a situation require his attention early this morning. He'll meet you at the filing stage." "A situation," she repeated. "Yes." She waited for elaboration. None came. "What kind of situation?" she said. Han looked at her over the rim of his glasses with the expression of a man deciding how much professional discretion required him to say versus how much honest communication required. He settled on, "The kind that happens when you run the operations Mr. Kang runs. Nothing that affects today's proceedings." Adriana filed this away and said nothing else about it. The consulate process took 3 hours and 40 minutes. It involved 2 officials, 4 sets of forms, a notarized translation of her father's will clause that Han had somehow produced overnight, and a phone call between Han and a Nigerian legal contact whose voice was tinny and authoritative through the speakerphone and who confirmed the bilateral recognition framework in about 40 words and then hung up without pleasantries. Jiheon arrived at the 90-minute mark. He came through the consulate door in a dark coat with rain on his shoulders and something in the set of his jaw that hadn't been there the night before. A tightness. Not anger exactly, more like controlled aftermath. The specific look of someone who had already handled something difficult and was now managing the residue. He sat beside her at the processing table without explanation or apology and picked up the documents Han slid toward him and read them with total focus, the same way she imagined he read everything, completely, without ceremony, with the particular attention of someone who had learned early that details were where things went wrong. She watched him for a moment out of her peripheral vision. "The situation," she said quietly, not looking up from her own set of forms. "Handled," he said, the same way. "You're going to tell me it's none of my concern." A brief pause. "It isn't, yet." The yet landed somewhere uncomfortable. She wrote her signature on the next line and didn't push it. The legal registration was confirmed at 2:14 p.m. Han produced the confirmation on his tablet and showed it to both of them with the restrained satisfaction of a man who had just done something technically difficult and knew it. The registration existed. It was filed. Under Nigerian civil law and the bilateral agreement framework, Adriana Okoye Now legally Adriana Okoye Kang, for the duration, would receive her father's estate in full at midnight. She sat with that for a moment. Not relief, exactly. Something more complicated. The specific emotional texture of a problem solved by a method you weren't sure yet how to feel about. "I'll need to call Lagos," she said. "Of course." Jiheon stood. "Use the car. I'll be a few minutes with Han." She took the car. She called Chisholm, and this time she explained. She kept it factual, efficient, the same way she'd explained the situation the night before. Legal marriage, 6 months, contract terms protecting the family assets, clean exit at the end. She said it all in about 3 minutes. The silence on the other end lasted longer than that. "Audrey," Chisholm said finally, in the voice she used when she was trying very hard not to say what she actually thought. "Don't. I wasn't going to say anything." "You were absolutely going to say something." Another pause. Are you safe?" "I'm in a consulate car on a Tuesday afternoon in Seoul. I'm completely fine." "That's not what I asked." Adriana looked out the window at the gray street. A woman was walking a very small dog with enormous ears, and the dog was trying to investigate every piece of pavement it passed over with intense, methodical focus. There was something almost comforting about the dog's commitment to its investigation. "I think so," she said honestly. "I'll know more in a week." "Call me," Chisholm said. "Every day. I don't care what time it is." Every day, Audrey." "Okay," she said. "Okay." She hung up as Jiheon got back into the car. They drove back toward the Han River district in silence that had a different quality than the silence of strangers. It was too aware of itself to be simply neutral. She was conscious of the space between them on the seat, the 8 inches that had been there on the corridor bench, and had reestablished itself here without either of them discussing it. "Tonight," he said, "I'll have the spare room prepared. You don't need to move your things until you're ready, but I'll stay at my apartment," she said. He looked at her. "The contract says legal marriage and public appearances," she continued before he could respond. "It doesn't specify cohabitation as an immediate condition. I'll move what I need to move when it becomes practically necessary. Until then, I'd rather keep my own space." He studied her for a moment. She couldn't read what was behind it. Calculation, perhaps, or something more basic than that. The look of a man encountering a boundary he hadn't anticipated and deciding whether to push it. He didn't push it. "Fine," he said. "We'll need a public appearance within the week, given the timeline. My grandmother's doctor has indicated she may have limited time remaining. I'd like to bring you to see her as soon as possible." "I understand. And there's a charity gala Thursday evening. It would be the appropriate venue to establish the marriage publicly. The guest list includes people whose attention I need on this." "Whose attention specifically?" He looked at her directly. "People who watch what I do and look for weakness. A new wife, unknown background, married quickly. They'll have questions. How we present Thursday will determine the nature of those questions." "You want them to believe it's real." "I want them to believe it's real enough that they don't investigate the alternative." She absorbed this. "What happens if they investigate the alternative?" The look he gave her then was the first time she'd seen something in his face that was wholly unguarded. Not a crack in the mask so much as a momentary dropping of it. A look that said she should understand this was not an abstract question he was answering for her benefit. "Nothing good," he said. She nodded once. "Thursday. What time?" Thursday came with the specific atmospheric pressure of events that were going to change something whether or not you were ready for them to. She spent Wednesday working her usual shift at Gumong, which felt surreal in the way that unchanged routines always felt surreal after your fundamental circumstances had shifted. The kitchen was the same kitchen. The orders were the same orders. Chef Park told her the scheduling adjustment had been arranged and didn't ask any questions, which she was grateful for. 2 of the other floor staff gave her looks that said rumors had started but not yet solidified into specifics. And she moved through both looks with the practiced invisibility she'd developed over 14 months of being the person in the room that certain people reflexively underestimated. The dress arrived at her apartment Thursday morning. Not a text asking for her size, not a request. Just a delivery, a matte black box with a note in Han Seo-jun's handwriting, practical and without presumption, that said the event had a specific dress code and that Mr. Kang had taken the liberty, but that she should feel free to wear whatever she preferred. She opened the box out of curiosity more than anything else. The dress was deep green, the kind of green that was almost black in certain light and entirely itself in others. It had the weight and construction of something built rather than manufactured, and it fit when she tried it on in a way that shouldn't have been possible given that no one had taken her measurements. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror and looked at herself for a long moment. Then she put it on. The car came at 7. Jiheon was in it this time, already there when she got in a black suit that matched the night outside, and he looked at her when she sat down across from him in that considering way he had, thorough without being invasive, and said, "Good." She said, "Did someone tell you my measurements, or did your attorney guess?" "I had your employee file." "My employee file has my work visa dimensions and my food handler certification. It also has the physical description from your entry documentation." She stared at him. "You ran my entry documentation. I had it when we first drafted the contract framework. Han keeps thorough files. That's either very efficient or very alarming." "Both," he said without apology, and looked out his window. The gala was held in a building near Gangnam that had been designed by someone with very strong opinions about glass and the drama of vertical space. They arrived at 7:40, and the entrance was already populated with the specific kind of beautiful people who moved through expensive events like weather systems, unhurried, self-contained, generating their own pressure fronts. Jiheon put his hand at the small of her back when they went through the entrance. It was a light touch, entirely appropriate for the context. Professionally calculated, probably. She knew all of this and still felt it in her spine in a way that she immediately filed under irrelevant and moved past. The first hour was a masterclass in being looked at. She was aware of it the moment they entered the main room, the recalibration that happened in clusters of people as Jiheon entered their peripheral vision, and then the secondary recalibration when they registered who he was with. Not hostility, mostly. More like calculation. The particular attention of people who made their livings understanding social arrangements and were now rapidly processing a new variable. A woman in red, 50s, the kind of maintained appearance that required significant ongoing investment, approached them 20 minutes in with the unhurried confidence of someone accustomed to being the most significant person in her immediate radius. "Jiheon!" She air-kissed his cheek with the practiced ease of someone who had done it 10,000 times. "We've been wondering when you'd show your face. Madam Cho." He was perfectly warm, perfectly managed. "May I introduce my wife, Adriana?" Madam Cho turned to Adriana with a smile that started in her mouth and didn't quite reach anywhere else, and said in accented English, "How lovely! And you're from Nigeria," Adriana said, cleanly, before the woman could complete whatever gentler construction she'd been building toward. "Lagos, originally. I've been in Seoul for 2 years." "How interesting." The smile stayed exactly where it was. "And how did you and Jiheon—" "We met at a restaurant," Jiheon said. Smooth, immediate, leaving no space for elaboration or improvisation. "She made an impression." "I imagine she did." Madame Cho's eyes moved over Adriana with the specific attention of a person cataloging details for later distribution. "Well, we're all delighted." She moved on with the ease of a ship changing course. Adriana watched her go. "She'll have made 4 phone calls by the end of the night," she said quietly. 6, Jiheon said beside her. "But the information she'll pass along will be the version that serves her interests, which in this case happens to align with ours." "How so?" "She's been trying to establish a business connection with the Lagos Investment Group for 8 months. Having a connection to someone with Nigerian family ties is suddenly very useful to her." He took 2 glasses from a passing tray and handed her one. "People generally believe what they want to believe. Our job tonight is to give them something worth wanting." She looked at the glass in her hand. Champagne, which she'd never particularly liked, but which was the correct thing to hold in a room like this. "You're very good at this." "At what?" "Managing how you're perceived." He looked at her sideways. "Is that a criticism?" "No," she said honestly. "It's an observation. You do it completely, without visible effort. I find that either impressive or troubling, and I haven't decided which." Something moved through his expression that might, in a different face, have been amusement. Most people decide immediately. Most people react to things before they understand them, she said. I try not to. He looked at her for a beat longer than the conversation required, and then a man in a gray suit arrived at his elbow with the specific urgency of someone who had been waiting for an opening, and Jiheon shifted smoothly into the register of professional engagement, and the moment passed. The man in the gray suit was named Director Lim. Adriana placed him within 60 seconds. The way his eyes moved to her and then quickly away, the practiced neutrality of his greeting, the particular quality of someone being polite to a person whose presence he resented. She'd encountered versions of Director Lim her entire professional life. She smiled at him with the precise warmth of someone who knew exactly what he thought and had no interest in making him comfortable about it. When Lim drifted away to find someone more amenable to his specific social agenda, Jiheon said quietly, without moving his gaze from the middle distance, "He's going to ask someone about your background before the night is over." "I know. Does that bother you?" "Does it bother you?" she returned. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with a flatness that had an edge under it, "No." She believed him. That was a strange thing. The word came out in a way that wasn't managed or calculated. It was just true, delivered without performance, and she believed it the way she believed very few things people told her in the first days of knowing them. The second hour was harder. A group of women in the corner of the room had been observing her with the sustained attention of people who had decided something before they'd finished deciding, and were now simply building the architecture to support what they already believed. She was aware of this the way you were aware of weather changing. Not by seeing it directly, but by what it did to the quality of the air. When one of them approached, younger than Madame Cho, the specific confidence of inherited money rather than earned money, and said, in English that was slightly too loud, "Your Korean must still be developing, of course. It's very difficult for people who come here for work rather than other reasons." Adriana felt the shape of the moment clearly. She could deflect. She was very good at deflecting. She didn't. "My Korean is functional," she said, and switched to Korean, precisely calibrated, not perfect, nothing that would embarrass her, but clear and direct enough to shift the woman's expression from condescension to a recalibration she visibly hadn't prepared for. She switched back to English for the last sentence. "I find it's usually better to know the language of wherever you are, rather than assume other people will accommodate you." The beat of silence had a specific texture. Then Jiheon said, from directly beside her, in a voice that was completely calm and absolutely final, addressing the woman, "My wife spent 2 years building a life in a country that wasn't hers. I'd suggest that earns a degree of respect most people in this room haven't." It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was the particular kind of statement that ended conversations the way a door closing ended them. Complete, with no opening left. The woman left. Adriana didn't look at Jiheon. She looked at her champagne glass, and she felt something she hadn't anticipated feeling, a warmth that was inconvenient and poorly timed and entirely real. And she put it down somewhere practical in her chest and kept it there. "You didn't need to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "I had it." "I know that too." She looked at him then. He was looking at the room, the same controlled survey he'd been running all night. But there was something different in the line of his jaw. Something that had moved and not fully returned to where it had been. "Don't protect me at social events," she said. "Not from words. I've been handling words my entire life. If you do it, they'll think I need protecting, and then every time I walk into a room without you, I'll be working twice as hard to establish I don't." He turned to look at her. The look was long and direct, and she held it without blinking. "You're right," he said. She hadn't expected that. The immediate, clean concession. No defensiveness, no reconstruction into something that made him right anyway. She nodded, looked back at the room. "But for what it's worth," he said quieter, "it wasn't for strategy." She didn't answer that. She filed it in the same place she'd put the warmth, in the practical section of her chest where things went that couldn't be dealt with yet. "What?" They left at 10:30. In the car, the silence came back, but it was different again from the morning, denser, warmer, carrying the residue of 3 hours in a room together. She could feel tiredness hitting her properly now, the specific crash of sustained performance. Her jaw ached slightly from the controlled smiling. Her feet hurt less than usual because the heels on the dress shoes were better constructed than anything she owned. She was looking out of the window when he said, "She wants to meet you Sunday." "Your grandmother?" "Yes." A pause. "The doctors think it's important that she has things to look forward to, calendar events. I've been trying to keep her engaged." Adriana looked at him. In the dark of the car, his profile was cut clean against the city lights moving past the window. The tightness from Tuesday was still there, just below the surface, the managed residue of something she still didn't have the context for. "I'll be there," she said. "It may be emotional," he said. She knows the situation is not exactly conventional. She doesn't know the specific terms, but she understands that I don't." He stopped, started differently. "She's going to ask you things, personal things. She does that. I can handle personal questions. She's very direct. So am I." He looked at her. In the brief light of a passing street lamp, she caught something in his face that was almost helpless. The look of a man confronting a situation he'd constructed logically and was now realizing logic only reached so far. "What do I tell her about us?" Adriana said. "When she asks, tell her the truth where you can. The rest," he looked back out his window. "She'll fill in the rest herself. She always does." The car moved on through the city. Adriana looked at her hands in her lap, the burn scar, the hangnail she still hadn't dealt with, and thought about Sunday, and a dying old woman who had raised a monster and somehow, in the process, kept some essential part of him human enough that he'd sat in a service corridor on a rainy Tuesday night and offered a stranger a solution to an impossible problem. She thought about what Jiheon had said in the consulate car. Nothing good. The something that would happen if people investigated the alternative. She hadn't pressed it then. She pressed it now, internally, turning it over, looking at the shape of it. She'd signed a contract with a man whose operations existed in a world with its own rules and its own consequences and its own definition of what handled meant when someone called it a situation. She had known this going in. She had calculated it and accepted it and told herself she could manage the distance between his world and hers. She believed that still. But Tuesday's tightness was still in his jaw on Thursday night, and the situation still hadn't been explained. And somewhere in the city around this car, there were people who watched what Kang Jiheon did and looked for weakness. And she was the newest and most visible weakness he had. And she was only 3 days into 6 months. She was still thinking about this when the car stopped at her building. "Sunday," he said, 10 a.m. "I'll be ready," she said. She got out. The night air was cold and clean after the gala's heavy warmth. She went inside without looking back. Sunday arrived the way difficult things arrived, without ceremony, just suddenly there. Jiheon's car came at 9:58, which she noted because it was the first sign that punctuality was not a performance for him, but a default. She was waiting in the lobby when it pulled up. She dressed carefully, not for formality, but for the specific situation of meeting someone's dying grandmother, while pretending a marriage was something other than what it was. She'd settled on a dark burgundy blouse and simple trousers and the small gold earrings that had been her mother's, because she wanted something real on her body that morning, something with actual weight. Jiheon looked at her when she got in and said nothing for a moment. Then, "She'll like you." "You don't know that." "I know her, and I know—" He stopped, the same way he'd stopped on Thursday, catching himself before whatever he'd been about to say arrived. "She'll like you." The house was not what she expected. Not because it was small. It was modest by the standards of what she'd expected from a man in Jiheon's position. A traditional hanok in a quieter district, maintained with the loving precision of someone who understood that a house was not a status symbol, but a container for a life. There were plants in the courtyard. Real ones, not the architectural kind. A small stone water feature that was running, its sound just audible when the car door opened. Inside it smelled like ginger tea and something herbal, and the particular warmth of a house that had been lived in completely. Kang Hana was in the main room, 78 years old, small, in the way that people sometimes became small without diminishing. The weight shifted, the frame contracted, but the presence remained entirely intact. She was sitting in a chair with a blanket across her lap and her hands folded over it, and when Jiheon led Adriana into the room, she lifted her head and looked at her with eyes that were dark and direct and entirely clear. Adriana understood immediately what Jiheon had meant. There was no softening in those eyes. No polite management. Just a woman who had been reading people for nearly 8 decades and had stopped seeing any reason to pretend otherwise. Jiheon said in Korean, "Grandmother, this is Adriana." Kang Hana looked at Adriana for a long moment. Then she said, in careful, deliberate English, "Sit close. My hearing is not what it was." Adriana sat in the chair beside her. Jiheon took a seat across the room, far enough to give them space, close enough to be present. Hana looked at Adriana's hands, then her face, then her hands again. "You work with your hands," she said. "Yes, in a restaurant. Jiheon's restaurant. I was there before—" She stopped. "Yes. Now." Hana nodded slowly. "Your mother's earrings." Adriana's hand went to her ear before she could stop it. "Yes. You wear them when you are nervous." "I wear them when I want something real on my body," Adriana said, because it was true, and because lying to this woman felt physiologically impossible. Hana looked at her for another long moment. "He doesn't bring people here," she said. "Not for 20 years. Not since his parents." She paused. "You know what he is." "I know some of it. Most women who know what he is either want something from it or they leave." Hana's eyes were steady. "You don't look like either." "I needed something," Adriana said. "Honestly, that's how this started." "What did you need?" She told her. Briefly, cleanly, the will, the clause, the timeline. She left out nothing important and added nothing that wasn't there. And when she finished, Kang Hana was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded over the blanket with the stillness of someone who had heard many things in her life and had learned to sit with information before responding to it. "He could have found someone easier," Hana said finally. "I know." "He didn't." The room was quiet. The water feature sound came faintly through the walls. Jiheon was still across the room, not moving, watching his grandmother, the way people watched things they were terrified of losing. Hana reached out and took Adriana's hand. Her grip was light but deliberate. "He needs warmth," she said. "Not someone who manages him. Not someone who fears him. Warmth. He has forgotten what it feels like." Adriana felt the weight of those words in a way that had nothing to do with the contract in Han's briefcase. "I'm not sure I can promise that," she said honestly. Hana looked at her. The eyes were direct and certain and entirely unsentimental. "You already have," she said, "or you wouldn't still be sitting here being honest with an old woman when a lie was available." The room held that for a moment. Then Hana released her hand and said to Jiheon in Korean, "She stays for lunch." Jiheon said, for the first time since Adriana had met him, looked like something in him had loosened by a fraction, something below the controlled surface, something old and tired and quietly desperate. "Yes," he said. Lunch was quiet and warm and entirely unperformed. Hana's housekeeper brought food, and Hana asked Adriana about her sisters and her father and Seoul in the way that people ask things when they actually wanted to know the answers. And Adriana answered with the specific relief of someone who had been running carefully managed versions of themselves for so long that being asked for the real thing felt like putting down something very heavy. Jiheon sat across the table and said little, and ate everything and watched his grandmother the way he hadn't watched anything else all week, with the concentrated attention of a man trying to memorize a face. On the drive back, Adriana sat with the weight of the morning and said nothing for the first 15 minutes. Then she said, "She knows." "Yes. She knew before I said anything. She always does." "She's not going to say anything." A pause. "No, she's not." Adriana looked out the window. The city moved past. The same city it had been a week ago, before the hallway and the contract and the consulate and the gala and the old woman with her late mother's earrings and a grip like a closing door. "She loves you," Adriana said. "Completely." Jiheon said nothing. "The kind of love that doesn't require you to be different than you are," she said. "That's rare. You should know that." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, very quietly, "I know." She looked at his profile, the jaw, the managed surface, The tightness that was still there from Tuesday, and the thing beneath it that she was beginning, against her better judgment, to understand was not coldness at all. "What was the situation?" she said. "Tuesday." He looked at her. "You said handled," she continued. "I'm not asking for operational details. I'm asking because I've been in your world for a week, and I'm going to be in it for 5 more months, and I need to understand the shape of the risks I'm adjacent to." It was a reasonable request. She'd phrased it as a reasonable request. She watched him process it. The calculation, the assessment, the decision. "One of my competitors has been making inquiries," he said, "about the marriage. About you specifically." Her stomach did something unpleasant. "Since Tuesday," he said, "someone talked. My team identified the source and handled the immediate exposure, but the inquiry is ongoing." He looked back at the window. "I want you to know I have people watching your building. It's discreet. You won't see them, but they're there." The silence that followed had a different quality than any silence they'd shared so far. "You have someone watching me," she said, "for your protection, without asking me." A pause. "Yes." The car moved through Seoul. Outside the window, a group of school children in uniforms were crossing a street with an adult at each end shepherding them across, and for a moment the ordinary human geometry of it, children, adults, a crossing, felt very distant from the interior of this car. "You should have asked me," she said. Her voice was controlled. She was making an effort, and she could feel the effort. "You're right. You cannot make decisions about my safety unilaterally. I understand the risk, I accept the risk, but I'm an adult making informed choices, not—" "I understand," he said. "You're right, I should have told you. Before you did it. Before I did it." He was meeting her eyes fully. "I'm accustomed to moving quickly when there's a threat. I didn't think it—" He stopped. It was the wrong call. She held the eye contact for a moment. Then she looked away, because the look in his eyes when he said, "I didn't think," was not the look of a man managing a situation. It was the look of a man who had reacted to something with a gut-level instinct that had bypassed his usual systems entirely, and who was sitting with the exposure of that fact. She filed that away too. "Tell me when there are developments," she said. "Whatever they are. I can handle information. What I cannot handle is being kept in the dark about risks that are directly about me." "Agreed. And tell your people watching my building to rotate positions. The man in the gray jacket has been standing at the same corner for 6 hours. If I noticed him, other people can." A silence. Then, "You made him." "I notice things," she said. "It's how I've gotten through most of my life." He looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was becoming familiar. That particular quality of attention that felt less like assessment and more like something else she didn't have a clean word for yet. The car slowed at her building. "I'll keep you informed," he said. "Going forward." She nodded, put her hand on the door. "Adriana." She stopped. "Thank you," he said. "For today. For what you gave her." She looked at him over her shoulder. His face was different. The composed surface was still there, but something beneath it had shifted. Some internal arrangement had moved, and she could see the shape of it even if she couldn't name the specific parts. "She's easy to be honest with," Adriana said. "That's rare too." She got out. She was halfway to the building entrance when her phone vibrated. Unknown number. She stopped walking and stared at it. The message was in English, 7 words. "You don't know what you married into." She stood on the pavement outside her building in the Sunday afternoon light and read it twice and felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the weather. Behind her, the black car was still at the curb. She didn't turn around. She went inside instead and rode the elevator to her floor and stood in her small apartment with her mother's earrings still on and her phone in her hand and the message on the screen, and understood that the shape of the next 5 months had just changed into something she hadn't signed up for. The question was whether she was already too deep inside it to walk out. She didn't sleep Sunday night. Not the restless, turning kind of not sleeping where you kept almost getting there and pulling back. The fully awake kind. The kind where your body was horizontal and your eyes were closed and your mind was running hard laps around a 7-word message on a phone screen that was now sitting face down on her kitchen counter because she couldn't keep looking at it. You don't know what you married into. By 3 a.m., she'd constructed and discarded 6 different explanations for who sent it. A competitor's warning. A test from Jiheon's people to see how she'd react. Someone from the gala who'd gotten her number through channels she couldn't trace. The source Jiheon's team had identified Tuesday, the one who'd talked, the one they said was handled, the one who apparently hadn't been handled completely enough. By 4 a.m., she'd stopped trying to explain it and started trying to decide what to do with it. She could tell Jiheon. She should tell Jiheon. She knew she should tell Jiheon the same way she knew she should have left the dress in the box on Thursday morning and worn her own clothes to the gala. The reasonable, self-protective choice was obvious. She also knew that telling him meant watching him move into action mode, the handled voice, the decisions made before she was consulted. The gray jacket man outside her building multiplying into a perimeter she'd have no part in designing. She told him clearly in the car, "I cannot handle being kept in the dark about risks that are directly about me." If she handed this to him without having done her own thinking first, she was doing to herself what she'd asked him not to do to her. So she thought. She lay in the dark, and she thought for 4 hours, and at 6 a.m. she got up and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the phone face up and the message on the screen and looked at it in the early gray light until it stopped feeling like a threat and started feeling like information. Information she didn't have the context for yet. She typed a message to Jiheon at 6:23 a.m. 8 words. "Something happened last night. Can we talk today?" His response came in 40 seconds. "I'm sending the car." She almost told him not to. She typed it out. "I can come to you," and then deleted it and said nothing because some part of her had registered that 40-second response and understood what it meant about the kind of attention he was paying to his phone at 6:23 on a Sunday morning, and she needed to sit with that instead of deflecting it. The penthouse was the first time she'd been to it. She'd seen it referenced in the contract, the primary residence, the address where correspondence would be filed, but she hadn't been there, hadn't needed to be, had kept her apartment as the line between his world and a space that was entirely hers. The elevator opened directly into the entry hall, and she stepped out into a space that was large and quiet, and had the particular quality of rooms that were maintained perfectly and inhabited sparsely. Floor-to-ceiling windows on the far wall showed Seoul in the early morning. The city muted and gray-blue, the Han River catching thin light, the scale of everything that the city always insisted on. Jiheon was in the kitchen, in dark trousers and a white shirt with the sleeves pushed to his elbows, making coffee with the focused economy of someone for whom even routine tasks got their full attention. He looked up when she came in, and something in his face shifted. A rapid, almost involuntary assessment, checking her over the way people checked over people they were worried about before they decided whether they were going to admit they were worried. "Show me," he said. No preamble. No good morning. She appreciated that. She put the phone on the counter between them. He read the message. The stillness that came over him was different from his usual stillness. Denser, directed inward. The look of someone rapidly cross-referencing what they were seeing against a map of things they already knew. "When?" he said. "Last night, after I went upstairs." Unknown number. Yes. He picked up his own phone and typed something quickly, then set it down. The coffee finished behind him, and he poured 2 cups without looking and pushed one toward her. "I need to know," she said. "All of it. Whatever the situation is that's been the situation since Tuesday. I need to know the actual shape of it." He looked at her. "Don't calculate how much to tell me," she said. "Don't manage it. I signed a contract that put me in your world for 6 months, and someone sent a message to my personal phone, which means they have my number, which means the separation I thought existed between my life and your operations is already compromised. So tell me." He was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough that she felt the particular patience becoming anger transition beginning at the base of her throat. Then he said, "Sit down." She sat. He stayed standing, both hands flat on the counter, looking at the coffee. When he talked, it was in the measured, deliberate cadence of someone who had been deciding how to say something for days and was now accepting that the deciding was over. "There's a man named Ryu Tai-sung," he said. "He runs operations in the Port District and a network of financial channels that runs through 3 countries. We've been in a territorial arrangement with him for 4 years. Managed distance. Neither side expanding into the other's space. Something changed. 6 months ago, before any of this." He gestured, meaning her, meaning the contract, meaning all of it. I moved on an opportunity in the Western Corridor. It was clean, legal on the surface, entirely within what our arrangement had always permitted by the agreed understanding. Ryu interpreted it differently. He's been building a response since then. What kind of response? The kind that involves identifying pressure points. He finally looked up at her. When our marriage became public Thursday, I became aware that Ryu's people had been actively interested in who you were before the announcement was made, which means someone in my organization communicated information ahead of the public timeline. The coffee was warm in her hands. She focused on that. Someone in your organization? Yes. Someone told Ryu about me before Thursday. Yes. So the leak Tuesday was not an accident and was not fully handled. She put the cup down carefully. The sound of it on the counter was very small in the large, quiet kitchen. There's someone in your organization passing information to a competitor, she said. And that person, or Ryu directly, sent a message to my phone last night. That's the current understanding, yes. She looked at him. He was watching her with the controlled attention of someone waiting for a specific response and not willing to prompt it. She thought about the shape of this, the arrangement she'd signed, the assumption that the risks were adjacent rather than direct, the 6 months she'd calculated she could manage. How serious is Ryu? She said. Serious enough that I've been careful for 4 years. What does serious look like in practice? A pause. 3 years ago, a man who owed Ryu a significant financial obligation disappeared. The obligation was 8 months overdue. The man had a family. He said it flatly. He was found after 2 weeks. The family was not harmed, but the message was clear. The kitchen was very quiet. And I'm a pressure point, she said. You're visible, new, unknown background, married quickly. He said each thing with the precise neutrality of someone who had already processed the emotional content and was operating in the factual remainder. To someone looking for leverage, you're an obvious place to start. To scare you. To test how I respond when something I value is threatened. The word value sat in the room between them. She didn't touch it. What do we do? She said. We find the leak first, before anything else. He picked up his phone and looked at whatever had come back from his earlier message. His jaw tightened fractionally. Han is already working the communications timeline. We'll have a narrowed list within 24 hours. And in the meantime, I walk around Seoul with a message on my phone from someone connected to a man who makes problems disappear. In the meantime, you have a very competent team you can't see managing your immediate perimeter. I told you. I know what you told me. His voice was still controlled, but something under it had shifted. A heat she hadn't heard from him before, banked low but present. And I heard you. But there's a difference between me making unilateral decisions about your life and me doing my job when someone puts a target on you because of me. You don't have to like the second one, but I'm not stopping it. She looked at him. He looked back. The heat under his voice was not anger at her. She understood this clearly, looking at his face. It was the specific controlled fury of someone who was angry at a situation they'd created, angry at themselves, at the exposure, at the fact that moving on an opportunity 6 months ago had drawn a line from that decision straight to a message on a stranger's phone at 11 p.m. on a Sunday night. Okay, she said. He blinked, slightly, almost nothing, but she caught it. He'd expected her to push back further. Find the leak, she said. Tell me what you need from me to help. And tell me every development as it happens. You shouldn't have to... Jiheon. She said his name the way he'd said hers in the corridor, that first time, with weight. It landed and he stopped. I'm not a victim in this. I'm a participant. Treat me like one. Something in his face moved, something that arrived and didn't entirely leave. Every development, he said, as it happens. Thank you. She picked up her coffee. He watched her for a moment. That look again. The one she kept filing away in the practical section of her chest. The one that felt less like assessment and more like someone slowly recognizing terrain they hadn't expected to be in. 22 hours later, they found the leak. Adriana was at work, mid-shift, the lunch service running at its standard controlled intensity, when her phone buzzed with a message from Jiheon. 2 words, come tonight, She came at 9. The penthouse had 3 other people in it when she arrived. Han Seo-jun, standing near the windows with his tablet, looking the way he always looked, but with an additional layer of tight controlled something that she registered immediately. 2 men she hadn't met, large, quiet, positioned near the room's exits in the particular way of people for whom positioning near exits was professional habit. Jiheon was standing at the center of the room, and in the chair across from him, with his hands folded in his lap and his face carrying the specific gray pallor of a man who had been sitting in his own consequences for several hours, was someone she recognized, Kim Do-yoon, 31 years old, Jiheon's personal assistant for 6 years, the man who had confirmed her car pickups, who had been present at the consulate, who had handed her the schedule adjustments with Chef Park with a smile that she now retroactively understood was the smile of someone managing guilt. She stopped walking when she saw him. Jiheon looked at her across the room. The look said, "I know." She stood still and breathed through it. Do-hyun looked at her. His expression had the collapsed quality of a man who had already confessed everything there was to confess and was now simply sitting inside the aftermath. No anger, no performance, just the hollowed-out look of someone on the other side of a decision that had already destroyed its own reasoning. "How much?" Adriana said. She directed it at Do-hyun. He blinked. He'd expected, she thought, for the question to go through Jiheon. "How much did you tell them and when?" she said. Do-hyun looked at his hands. "The timeline of the marriage, your name, your employment." A pause. "Your phone number." "When?" "Wednesday morning, after the consulate." "Before the gala?" "Yes." "So, everything that happened Thursday, Madam Cho, Director Lim, the woman in the corner, Ryu's people already knew I was coming." He said nothing, which was its own answer. Adriana looked at Jiheon. He was watching her with the particular focused stillness of someone who had arranged this meeting and wasn't sure, even now, how it was going to go. "Why?" she said to Do-hyun. "Adriana," Jiheon started. "I'm asking him." She kept her eyes on Do-hyun. "Why?" Do-hyun looked up. His eyes were wet, which she noted without softening toward it. "My brother has a debt. With Ryu's organization, 300 million won. They came to me 8 months ago. I told myself I would give them nothing that mattered." He stopped. "I told myself that for 8 months. And then something that mattered appeared," she said. "Yes." The room was very quiet. She looked at this man, 31 years old, the hollowed-out face, the folded hands, and felt the specific cold clarity that arrived when she stopped processing something emotionally and started processing it as pure fact. He had given her phone number to people connected to a man who made problems disappear. He had done it to save his brother from a debt he'd spent 8 months telling himself wasn't his to manage. She understood the math of it. She understood the desperation of it. She had signed a contract in a service corridor 2 weeks ago because she understood exactly what it meant to be cornered by someone else's choices and have nothing left but bad options. Understanding it didn't make it less dangerous. "Is your brother still alive?" she said. Do-hyun looked up sharply. "What?" "His debt to Ryu. Is it paid now? Did they tell you giving them my information cleared the debt?" A silence, longer than it should have been. "They said—" He stopped. "They said it was a gesture of good faith." "A gesture of good faith," she repeated. "Not a cleared debt." He stared at her. The blood had left his face in a specific way that told her he'd been holding on to the good faith framing for 2 days and had just watched it collapse. "They own you now," she said. "Not cruelly, just factually, the way you told someone their roof was gone. Not to hurt them, but because they needed to know. A gesture of good faith means they'll come back. They'll always have something to come back for. The debt was leverage. It still is." Jiheon was watching her. She could feel it. Do-hyun looked at his hands and said nothing for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "I know." She looked at Jiheon. He met her eyes. Something passed between them that wasn't speech. A mutual registration of the situation, its shape, its implications. And she turned and walked out to the far end of the room near the windows and stood looking at the city and let him handle the rest of it, because there was nothing more she needed to say to Do-hyun, and there were things she needed to think through before she said anything else to anyone. The city was enormous out there, indifferent in the way cities were indifferent, going on being itself regardless of what happened in the rooms above it. Behind her, she heard the quiet, controlled sounds of a situation being managed. She thought about her phone number in Ryu Tai-sung's organization. She thought about a message from a stranger and a man in a gray jacket on a corner. She thought about what Jiheon had said in the car, the kind that happens when you run the operations Mr. Kang runs. She thought about 6 months and what 5 months remaining looked like from where she was standing. The two men she didn't know took Do-hyun somewhere she wasn't told about. Han left 20 minutes after that with his tablet and the specific expression of someone who had 3 things to file and 2 calls to make before midnight. Jiheon poured 2 glasses of water and brought one to her at the window and stood beside her in the dark. "He'll be okay," he said. "Do-hyun, I've already had someone contact his brother's situation. It'll be resolved." She took the water. "And Do-hyun, he's out, from my organization, safely." A pause that carried something in it, a specific weight. "He was with me 6 years. He stopped, started again. "It's handled." "You're not just angry at him," she said. "No. You're angry that you didn't see it." A longer pause. 6 years. He sat in every meeting. He knew every schedule. His voice was level, but the level was doing more work than usual. You couldn't have known," she said. "People don't show you they're cornered until they're already acting from it. That's the nature of it." He looked at her. "I know what cornered looks like," she said. "I was standing in a hallway 12 days ago." He was quiet. "The difference," she continued, "is what you do when you're there. Do-hyun made a choice that bought him 2 days of relief and a permanent debt. I made a choice I'm still not entirely sure about." She paused. "But I made it with full information. That matters." Outside, Seoul's light spread to the horizon in every direction, the city's scale making everything else feel provisional. "Ryu will move more directly now," Jiheon said. "He'll know we've identified the source. He won't have the same intelligence access." He turned slightly toward her, his profile reflected faintly in the dark glass, which means his next approach will be less subtle. "He'll come for me more directly. Possibly. Or he'll come for something around me that creates a public problem." He turned fully toward her. "I need to ask you something." "Ask." "The contract has a provision for early termination if circumstances become—" "No," she said. He stopped. "Don't offer me the exit clause," she said. "Not now. Not because of this." "You didn't sign up for Ryu Tai-sung." "I signed up for 6 months in your world with the understanding that your world was complicated." She looked at him directly. "I don't leave when things get complicated. That's not who I am." He held her gaze for a long moment. In the window's reflection, she could see both of them, her face steady, his carrying the look she was beginning to recognize as his version of being undone by something he hadn't prepared for. "Adriana," he said. "Tell me what the next step is," she said. "What do we do about Ryu?" He looked at her for one more moment. Then he straightened, set his glass down, and became the version of himself that ran operations. Not cold exactly, but organized. The emotional content filtered into action. "We use the Gala connections," he said. "Madam Cho's interest in Lagos investment groups. There's a partnership framework that, if announced publicly, creates a layer of international attention on our situation that makes any move against us, against you specifically, very visible and very costly for Ryu. A shield made of publicity. The best kind, quiet enough not to look defensive, loud enough to make aggression expensive." She nodded slowly. "You'd need to move fast, before Ryu recalibrates. Within the week. What do you need from me?" He looked at her. The look again. That particular quality of attention she kept putting in the practical section of her chest and finding it less easy to keep there every time. "A dinner," he said. "Madam Cho, 2 of her business contacts, and us. Presenting as a unit, public enough to register, controlled enough to manage." "I can do that." "It won't be comfortable." "Jiheon." She said his name and watched him absorb it. "I had my first job at 16 working double shifts to pay my secondary school fees. I've been uncomfortable my entire life. I know how to eat dinner at a table while people make calculations about me." She set her glass down beside his. "Schedule it." The dinner was Friday. It was everything he'd warned her it would be, and nothing she hadn't handled before, scaled up. Madame Cho brought two contacts, both male, both the particular strain of Korean businessman who had built their confidence on a foundation of everyone around them being slightly less certain. The restaurant was quiet and expensive, and the food was the kind that required explaining, which gave the evening a built-in rhythm that she used to establish herself as someone who ate the world with confidence rather than someone being introduced to it. She talked business. She talked Lagos. She talked about the specific investment landscape in the western Nigerian corridor with the precision of someone who had grown up listening to her father discuss it over dinner for 20 years. And she watched the two businessmen's polite attention shift into something more alert. And she felt Jiheon beside her register the shift and say nothing, because saying nothing was the right move and he knew it. Madame Cho watched her with the calculating attention of a woman revising an assessment in real time. By the end of the main course, the conversation had moved from social to substantive, and by the time tea arrived, Madame Cho had said the specific thing, a public statement of intention regarding the Lagos connection, that Jiheon had been steering toward. In the car afterward, he sat beside her in a silence that had a different texture than any before. "You knew the investment landscape," he said. "My father was a cardiologist with strong opinions about where Nigeria's future capital flows were going. I grew up at his dinner table." She looked at the city passing. "I've spent 2 years in Seoul waiting tables because it paid better than anything I could get in Lagos at 24. That doesn't mean I'm only what this city has seen me do." He was quiet. "I know," he said. "You say that a lot. Because you keep being right." She looked at him. He was looking at the window, the city's light moving across his face, and the mask was very slightly down. Not gone, but shifted. The particular quality of someone at the end of a week that had cost them something they hadn't budgeted for. She thought about the 11 days she'd known him. She thought about a man sitting on a corridor bench at midnight with his elbows on his knees, saying "my grandmother" with the specific care of someone handling something that could shatter. She thought about the 40-second response to her 6 a.m. message and what that meant about where he'd had his phone and what he'd been doing with it. She put all of it in the practical section of her chest and closed the door on it and kept her eyes on the city. They were 5 minutes from her building when his phone rang. He looked at the screen. The change in his face was immediate and total. A draining of everything managed and controlled, replaced by something rawer and older than anything she'd seen from him. He answered before the second ring. She didn't speak Korean well enough to follow the words quickly, but she didn't need the words. She watched his face, and she understood the shape of what was happening before he hung up, and when he lowered the phone to his lap and sat very still in the back of the moving car, she felt it move through the space between them like a physical thing. "Your grandmother," she said. She fell. His voice was different, stripped of everything it usually carried, just the words. "She's at the hospital. They're saying..." He stopped. "They're not sure she's stable." The car was still moving. She didn't think about it. She reached across the 8 inches that had been between them since the first night and put her hand over his on his knee, and she felt him go very still under her hand, the way people went still when they were trying not to fall apart in front of someone, and the touch was making it harder. "Tell the driver," she said quietly. He told the driver. The car turned. The hospital at 11 p.m. had the particular quality of emergency hours, the hush of things being managed at speed, the specific smell of institutions working at full capacity, the feeling of time moving differently than it did anywhere else. Kang Hana was in a room at the end of a corridor. A nurse met them at the ward entrance and spoke to Jiheon in rapid Korean, and Adriana caught fragments. "Stable now, but the night is uncertain. She was asking for you. She was asking. They went in. The room was small, and the light was low, and the machines were doing their quiet, steady work. And Kang Hana was smaller in the hospital bed than she'd been in her chair Sunday afternoon. The weight of it, the difference between a woman in her own home surrounded by things she'd chosen, and this room, these lights, these sounds, hit Adriana somewhere she hadn't been expecting. Hana opened her eyes when they came in. She looked at Jiheon first. Something passed between them that had no words. Decades of it. All the complicated accumulation of what it meant to raise someone from the ashes of catastrophe and watch them become a thing the world feared, and love them anyway, because love didn't require you to love what they became. Then Hana looked at Adriana. She reached out her hand. Adriana crossed the room and took it without hesitation. And Hana's grip was lighter than Sunday, lighter than anything, and her eyes were very clear. "Stay," Hana said. "Not to Jiheon." Adriana looked at her. "Tonight," Hana said. "Stay." Jiheon behind her made no sound. "I'll stay," Adriana said. Hana's grip tightened fractionally. Just fractionally. She closed her eyes. Adriana sat in the chair beside the bed and held the old woman's hand and felt the full weight of 11 days settling on her at once. The contract, the corridor, the consulate, the gala, Doyun's folded hands, the 7-word message, Ryu Taesung's name, the dinner, Jiheon's voice saying "my grandmother" with that specific unguarded care, and understood with the clarity of 11 p.m. in a hospital room that the practical section of her chest where she'd been filing things had reached capacity. There was no more room. She looked up. Jiheon was standing in the doorway. He was looking at her the way she'd been told once, that people looked at things they didn't know how to survive losing, with a kind of desperate attention, as though the looking itself could hold something in place. She held his gaze, and understood for the first time that the thing she'd been filing carefully away for 11 days was already past the point of filing, that it had been past that point for longer than she'd admitted, and that Kang Hana, 78 years old and smaller than she'd been 4 days ago, was lying in a hospital bed having asked Adriana to stay, not Jiheon. Adriana, because she had seen in 11 days what Adriana had been trying not to see in herself. The contract had a 6-month end date. Her heart, apparently, had not read the contract. She stayed the whole night. Not because Hana asked again. The old woman slept within 20 minutes of them arriving, the machines doing their steady work, the room holding its low hum of sustained function. She stayed because leaving felt wrong in a way that had nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with something she'd stopped trying to categorize. Jiheon brought 2 chairs from the corridor. He set them beside the bed without asking if she wanted to stay, without saying anything at all, and sat in the one on his side and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and watched his grandmother breathe. They stayed like that for a long time. Around 2 a.m., a nurse came in, checked the monitors, made a small note, and left without disturbing anything. Around 3 a.m., the hospital settled into its deepest quiet, that specific 3 a.m. quality that had no equivalent at any other hour, a silence that felt less like absence and more like the world briefly holding its breath. Adriana looked at Jiheon. He hadn't moved in 2 hours. His jacket was off, folded over the back of the chair. The white shirt from the dinner was creased now, the sleeves still pushed up, and he was looking at his grandmother's face with the concentrated attention of someone trying to memorize every detail before the details changed. "She's stable," Adriana said quietly. "Tonight she is. That's what tonight gets to be." He looked at her. In the low hospital light, his face was stripped of everything he usually wore in front of the world. The management, the precision, the controlled surface. What was underneath it was not weak. It was just human and tired and frightened in the specific way of someone who understood exactly how loss worked because they'd survived it before and knew the weight of what was coming. "I don't know how to do this again," he said, very quietly, the words barely carrying across the space between the chairs. "Lose someone." "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "You don't have to know how. You just have to stay in the room." He looked at her. "That's all any of it is," she said. "Just staying in the room when it's hard to stay." He didn't answer. He looked back at his grandmother's face, and Adriana watched something move through him. Not release, not relief, but the small specific shift of a person who has been holding something alone for a very long time and has just, by a fraction, let someone else know the weight of it. She reached across and put her hand over his again. He turned his hand over under hers and held on. They stayed like that until morning came gray through the hospital window and Kang Hana slept on undisturbed, and Seoul outside went on being its enormous, indifferent self, and neither of them said anything else, because there was nothing else that needed to be said. Hana stabilized enough to be moved back home 3 days later. The doctors used careful language, comfortable, managed, quality of remaining time. That meant exactly what it meant, and no amount of management made it mean anything else. Jiheon heard it with his face set in the particular way of someone who had decided to process information rather than feel it, and Adriana stood beside him in the corridor outside the room and felt the decision happening in him and said nothing because he needed to make it himself. She went home. She worked her shifts. She called Chisholm twice and kept both calls short and factual because she didn't have the bandwidth for her sister's careful, loving worry, and because there were things happening inside her that she hadn't processed yet and couldn't process while trying to also manage someone else's concern. On the fourth day after the hospital, Han called her. "Mr. Kang asked that you be available this evening," Han said. "There's been a development with Ryu." She was between lunch and dinner service. She stepped into the back hallway. The same one, the fluorescent tube still occasionally flickering, the smell still garlic and industrial cleaner, and said, "What kind of development?" "The kind that requires your presence," Han said, with the specific professional neutrality that told her the kind was significant. 7 o'clock, the penthouse. She arrived at 6:58. Jiheon was not alone. There were 4 men in the main room she'd never seen before, arranged in the specific spatial pattern of people who defaulted to threat assessment and were currently conducting one. All of them registered her arrival and registered Jiheon's response to her arrival, a fractional easing of something in his posture, and recalibrated their own assessments accordingly. Han was there. Han gave her a brief nod that communicated, "This is serious, stay close, and trust the process." Jiheon crossed the room to her. He looked like he'd slept in the past 4 days, but not well. The specific thinness around his eyes of someone running on managed rest and adrenaline, and the kind of focused anger that was keeping everything functional. "He moved," Jiheon said. "Ryu. This morning, he made a formal approach to 3 of my primary business contacts. Not threatening, formally polite. Offering alternative arrangements, implying that my current situation creates instability that makes me a difficult long-term partner. He's trying to peel your network away. He's announcing that he thinks I'm weakened." Jiheon's voice was level. "The marriage, my grandmother, Do-hyun's removal creating a gap in my operations. He's read all of it as vulnerability and he's moving on it." She looked at the 4 men in the room. "Who are they?" "Mine. The people I trust most completely." A pause. "There are 4 of them, which is fewer than it should be and more than enough. What's the plan?" He looked at her. "That depends on you." She waited. "Ryu made contact with one of my contacts this morning," he said. "A man named Chairman Baek. 70 years old, significant influence across 3 industries, knows everyone in Seoul's business and financial world who matters. If Baek publicly aligns with Ryu, it's damaging. Manageable, but damaging. And if Baek publicly stays with you, then Ryu's approach reads as failed. The other contacts hold. His momentum stalls before it builds. So you need Baek to stay." "I need Baek to have a reason to stay that feels stronger than whatever Ryu offered him this morning." He looked at her directly. "Baek is old-fashioned in specific ways. He believes in legacy, family, the kind of stability that announces itself rather than negotiating itself." A pause that carried its weight clearly. "He's requested a meeting tonight. He specifically mentioned that he'd like to meet my wife." The room was very quiet. She understood what he was asking, the full shape of it. Not a gala performance, not a dinner with Madame Cho, but a direct high-stakes meeting where Kang Jiheon's wife needed to be fully, convincingly real to a 70-year-old man who had been reading people for 5 decades and whose decision tonight had operational consequences. "You're asking me to help you hold your network together," she said. "Yes." "By being someone you're not sure I am yet." He looked at her steadily. "By being exactly who you are, which is the only version that would work on Baek anyway." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the contract in Han's files. She thought about the 6 months and the exit clause she'd refused, and the practical section of her chest that had exceeded capacity in a hospital room 3 days ago. She thought about Jiheon's hand turning over under hers in the dark, and the weight of what he'd said. "I don't know how to do this again." And the look on his face when his grandmother's hand held hers on Sunday afternoon. She thought about Ryu Taesung and the seven-word message, and Do-hyun's hollowed-out face, and all the ways the world she'd stepped into had been more complicated than she'd calculated. She thought about the fact that complicated had never once made her leave anything she'd decided to stay in. "What time is Beck coming?" she said. Chairman Baek arrived at 8:15. 70s, but the kind of 70s that carried its age, with the confidence of a man who had always known that time was a resource rather than an enemy. He moved slowly, but without any suggestion of weakness, the deliberate pace of someone for whom arriving quickly had never been necessary. He had the particular weathered quality of someone who had outlasted many things and knew it. He looked at Adriana the moment he walked in, before he looked at Jiheon. She met his eyes without hesitation, without performance, without any of the managed warmth she deployed in rooms where she needed to establish something. She simply looked at him the way she looked at things she was genuinely curious about, which was directly and without pretense. Something in Baek's face shifted. "Chairman Baek." Jihyun's voice was even, professional, the specific register of respect without deference. "My wife, Adriana." "Mrs. Kang." Baek's English was careful and accented and entirely functional. He extended his hand. "I've heard very little and wondered considerably." "That's usually how it works when Jiheon is involved," she said, and shook his hand firmly. Baek looked at her. Then a sound came out of him that was, she clocked it with surprise, a genuine laugh. Short, real, arriving before he decided to allow it. They sat. Han brought tea and Jiheon and Baek moved through the opening ritual of men who had done business together for years and were now conducting a re-evaluation in the language of courteous indirection. And Adriana sat beside Jiheon and drank her tea and let the conversation find its own current before she entered it. Baek was watching her the way he was watching the room. Everything, all of it, the whole picture. 20 minutes in, he said to her, "You understand what tonight's conversation is actually about." "Yes," she said, "and you're not uncomfortable with that." "I'm very comfortable with people saying directly what they mean," she said. "I find it efficient." Baek looked at Jiheon. "She's not what I expected." "She never is," Jiheon said. "Ryu Taesung spoke to me this morning," Baek said, dropping the indirection entirely, addressing them both now. He suggested that Jiheon's current circumstances represent an instability, that the marriage was rushed, the background unknown, the timing of his grandmother's illness. He paused. That a man managing so many variables simultaneously is a man who cannot manage his operations with the attention they require. The room was quiet. "What did you tell him?" Adriana said. Baek looked at her. "I told him I would consider his perspective." "And what are you actually considering? Whether Jiheon made a decision that was foolish or one that was correct, but made quickly." He put down his tea. "In my experience, those two things look identical from the outside for a period of time. The difference only becomes visible later." "How much later?" she said. "That depends on what I see tonight." She looked at this 70-year-old man who had outlasted things and held his gaze and said the most honest thing she'd said in any professional context in Seoul. "I'm not going to tell you our marriage is what you'd have expected or what Ryu expects you to dismiss," she said. "I'm going to tell you that I'm sitting in this room because I chose to be here, knowing what it cost, knowing what it meant, knowing the full shape of it, not because I was managed or handled or positioned." She paused. "And I'm going to tell you that the man beside me hasn't once, not once in the weeks I've known him, made a decision that treated me as less than someone who deserved the full truth. That's rarer than anything else you'll find in this city." Baek was very still. "Ryu is betting on instability," she continued. "The instability he's describing doesn't exist. What exists is a man dealing with his grandmother dying and a competitor trying to read grief as weakness." She held Baek's eyes. "You've outlasted a lot of things. You know the difference between a man who's failing and a man who's being tested." Silence. Baek looked at Jiheon. Jiheon was looking at Adriana. The look on his face was, she registered it and felt it land somewhere that was no longer the practical section of anything. It was the look of a man who had stopped managing what was on his face entirely, and what was there in the unmanaged version was so clear and so exposed that she had to look away from it to keep her own composure intact. Baek said quietly, I'll make 2 calls tomorrow morning. The contacts Ryu approached. I'll be explicit. I appreciate that, Jiheon said. His voice was not entirely even. Don't thank me, Beck said. He was looking at Adriana. Thank her. He stood. The meeting was over with the efficiency of a man whose time was genuinely limited. Mrs. Kang, it was a considerable pleasure. Chairman Beck, she said. He left. The door closed. The 4 men who had been positioned in the room's periphery became slightly less rigid. Han exhaled almost inaudibly. Jiheon sat very still. She picked up her tea and found it had gone cold and put it back down. Adriana, Jiheon said. Don't. She said it before he could continue, because she could hear what was coming and she wasn't ready for it. Not here, not with Han and 4 other people in the room, and all of her own composure held together by the specific tension of a night that wasn't over yet. Not right now. He was quiet. She stood. I'm going to get some water. She walked to the kitchen and ran the tap cold and stood with both hands on the counter and breathed through the shaking she'd been containing for the last 40 minutes. It came out of her hands first, a slight tremor, the specific physical aftermath of sustained high-intensity performance, and she ran cold water over her wrists until it stopped. She heard the room behind her clearing. Han's voice, quiet and efficient. Movement. Doors. The room being managed back into its operational normalcy. Then footsteps. Jiheon came into the kitchen and stood on the other side of the counter. She didn't turn around. You didn't have to say those things, he said. They were true. They were more than what the situation required. I know. She turned the tap off. I know they were. The kitchen was quiet. The city was visible through the window above the sink. The same city, always the same city, enormous and indifferent and lit up in its 1,000 directions. The contract, he said, very carefully, like a man approaching something that might break. I know what the contract says. 6 months. We're not halfway. Jiheon. She turned around. He was standing with his hands at his sides and his face entirely open. No surface, no management, nothing between her and whatever was actually happening in him. And it was the most vulnerable she'd ever seen a person who wasn't crying look. It was the face of someone standing at the edge of something and not knowing how to step back from it and not entirely wanting to. She looked at him. She thought about her father's will and the hallway and the contract and the gala and the hospital and Do-hyun's folded hands and Hana's grip and tonight's room and Chairman Baek's careful 70-year-old eyes and the things she'd said that she'd meant so completely it had come out without architecture. She thought about the practical section of her chest, which no longer existed. I said the things I said because they were true, she said. Not because the contract requires them to be true. Not because the situation needed them. Because they were actually true. He was very still. That's a problem, she said quietly. For the contract. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and kissed her. Not the way she'd imagined it, in the involuntary way she'd been not imagining it for weeks. Not controlled, not managed, nothing strategic about it. Just completely direct. His hands on her face, her hands finding the front of his shirt, and the specific quality of a thing that had been held in place for too long finally released, which was not gentle and was not performance, and was entirely, completely real. When they broke apart, she was breathing hard, and his forehead was against hers, and his eyes were closed, and they stood like that in the kitchen with the cold water smell and the city lights, and her hands still in his shirt. The contract, she said against his jaw. I don't care about the contract. You said that like it was simple. It's not simple. He pulled back enough to look at her. His eyes were, she had never seen them like this, without a single layer of management between what he felt and what she could see. Nothing about this is simple, but I'm done pretending that what's happening is what the contract describes. She looked at him. She thought about 6 weeks ago. Standing in a rain-soaked service corridor, 26 years old, absolutely certain that the next thing she did needed to be purely practical and entirely survivable. She thought about how catastrophically that prediction had failed. Your grandmother, she said, when she gets home, she wants you there. She told me this morning. A pause. She said, and I'm translating directly because it's important, she said, don't be an idiot and let this one go. Something moved through Adriana's chest that was not entirely manageable, and she didn't entirely try to manage it. She said that, she said. She said that. And several other things I'm choosing not to translate because they were specifically about my emotional intelligence, and the assessment was not flattering. She laughed. It came out abrupt and real, and she felt it move through him. The sound of it, the specific quality of it, felt his hands tighten fractionally where they were. "There's still Ryu," she said. "Because there was." "There's still Ryu," he agreed. "BX calls bias time, not resolution." "Yes. Whatever comes next is going to be worse before it's better." His voice was steady. "The operational register, the honest version." "Yes, I know." She looked at him for a long moment. At this man, 34 years old, raised in violence, running operations that the city feared, standing in his own kitchen with his face completely open and his hands careful on her face like she was something he'd never expected to be trusted with and was determined not to break. She thought about what it cost to trust someone who ran the kind of operations that required 4 men positioned around a room. She thought about the fact that she was already in it, that the careful accounting she'd done, 6 months, clean exit, transaction complete, had been superseded by the actual events of the actual weeks, and that standing here arguing about terms was less honest than simply acknowledging what had already happened. "Okay," she said. He looked at her. "Whatever comes next," she said. "We handle it." Something crossed his face. The specific look of a man receiving something he didn't entirely know what to do with, something he hadn't let himself have for long enough that having it felt structurally uncertain, like weight on a beam he wasn't sure would hold. "Together," he said. Not a question. "Together," she said. His phone rang. They both went still. He looked at the screen. She watched his face change, the open expression closing not into management but into something harder and more direct, the face of someone moving into a situation that required everything he had. He showed her the screen. The name on it was not one she recognized, but the look on his face told her everything about what the call meant before he answered it. He answered. She heard 2 sentences of Korean, fast and clipped, and then Jiheon's voice, very quiet, very precise, saying 3 words in response. He hung up. "Ryu," she said. He didn't wait for Beck's calls. Jiheon was already moving, jacket from the chair, phone to his ear again, the operational version of him fully assembled in under 10 seconds with a speed that told her this was not a new register, but the most practiced one he had. He made a direct move. "Tonight." "What kind of move?" Jiheon looked at her. In the sharp clarity of the kitchen light, with his jacket on and his phone in his hand and the whole machinery of his world moving into gear around him, he looked at her the way he'd looked at her across the room from Chairman Beck's chair, like she was the still point in whatever was spinning. "He sent people to my grandmother's house," he said. The words landed like ice water. "Hana," she said. "The housekeeper called. 3 men arrived 20 minutes ago. They're—" His jaw was tight. "They haven't touched her. They're making a point, showing me the access they have, showing me they can reach the thing I can't replace." He was already moving toward the door. "It's a message." She was already moving with him. "Adriana." He stopped, turned. The look on his face was, she'd never seen it, the collision of every managed thing hitting the wall of something unmanageable at once. "You don't have to—" "I told you." Her voice was level. Her heart was not. "Together." He looked at her for 1 second, then, "Stay behind me. Do exactly what I say. If I say leave the room, you leave the room. No arguments." "Agreed." "I mean it." "So do I." He held her eyes for a beat that was very short and contained everything neither of them had finished saying in the kitchen, and then he turned and the 4 men were already in motion around them and the door was open, and the city outside was huge and cold and entirely indifferent to what was about to happen in a small traditional house, in a quieter district where an old woman sat with her blanket on her lap, and 3 men who meant nothing good had just walked through. The drive took 11 minutes. Adriana counted them the way she counted things when her body was running on adrenaline and her mind needed something to hold. The seconds between streetlights, the turns, the specific texture of Seoul's streets in the late-night hour when the city thinned to its essential self. Jiheon sat beside her in the back of the car and said nothing, and she could feel him assembling himself into whatever he needed to be for the next hour, the way a surgeon might in the corridor before a room they couldn't walk out of. The four men were in two cars bracketing theirs. Han had stayed at the penthouse to manage communications. The last thing he'd said as the door closed was a sequence of Korean words, clipped and precise, that Jiheon had acknowledged with a single nod, and she hadn't asked for a translation because the shape of it was clear enough. "Tell me what to expect," she said. Jiheon looked at the passing city. 3 men. Ryu sent them to establish presence, not to harm her. He needs her unharmed. If she's touched, he loses every relationship he spent 20 years building. No one in this city will work with a man who moves against old women in their homes. A pause. He knows that. This is psychological. He's making you come to him. He's making me come to her, showing me she can be reached. His jaw was tight. And watching how I respond tells him everything about what I'm willing to do. What are you willing to do? He looked at her. In the moving dark of the car, his face was very clear. Not the operational mask, not the managed surface, but the stripped-down version she'd seen in the hospital and the kitchen. Whatever it takes to end this permanently meaning, Ryu will never have reason to reach for anything of mine again after tonight. He held her eyes. I need you to understand what that means without me having to say it specifically. She understood. She sat with it for exactly as long as it required, and then she said, "Okay, you're not going to argue with me." "I told you what I believe about being cornered," she said. "People do what the situation requires. I don't have to like every shape that takes." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he looked back at the window and said, very quietly, "I'm sorry you're in this." "I'm not," she said. He turned sharply. "I'm not sorry I'm in it," she said. "I made the choices that put me here. All of them." She held his gaze. "I'm not a passenger in my own life. Don't apologize to me for that." The car slowed. Through the window, she could see the quiet street, the traditional district, the older buildings, the stone walls that lined the approach to Hana's house. 2 unfamiliar cars were parked badly at the near end. The specific carelessness of people who had come somewhere with the assumption that their presence itself was the message, and parking protocols were for people who didn't know that yet. Jiheon's hand found hers in the dark. Brief. Tight. Then he released it and the car stopped, and he was moving before she'd entirely processed the touch. The courtyard gate was open. Wrong. It should have been latched from inside. The specific wooden latch that Adriana had watched the housekeeper secure on Sunday when they left. It stood 3 inches open, which was not careless but deliberate, the same way the badly parked cars were deliberate. A series of small demonstrations. We were here. We opened what was closed. We can do it again. Jiheon went through the gate first. The 2 men directly behind him moved with the practiced economy of people for whom this kind of entry was technical rather than frightening. She came after, with the 3rd man beside her. A silent arrangement that Jiheon had made with a look and a gesture that she'd clocked as stay close to him. He's yours to manage. The courtyard had its plants and its water feature still running, the sound of it strange and ordinary against the specific tension of the night. The light was on inside the main room, visible through the paper screens, shapes moving behind it. Jiheon stopped at the entrance. He didn't knock. He opened the door and walked in. 3 men. She registered them in the order they turned. The one nearest the door first, mid-30s. The particular build of someone hired for presence rather than subtlety. The second near the far wall, younger, with the specific alertness of someone who had been told to watch and was watching everything. The third sitting in the chair across from Hana. Hana was in her chair, blanket on her lap, hands folded over it, looking at the 3rd man with an expression of such complete withering composure that Adriana, even in the tight-wired tension of the moment, felt something that was almost pride. The housekeeper, Mrs. O, was standing near the kitchen doorway, hands clasped in front of her, with the face of a woman who had decided that whatever happened, she was not going to give these men the satisfaction of her fear, and had been maintaining this position for 40 minutes. The 3rd man stood up when Jiheon entered. He was the one who mattered. The one in the chair, closest to Hana. The arrangement a statement in itself. 40s. well-dressed in the specific way of someone who wanted to establish they were a professional rather than muscle. The face of someone accustomed to being the representative of consequences. "Mr. Kang," the man said, in Korean, then in English, glancing at Adriana. "Both of you." "Good." Jiheon said nothing. He walked to Hana, checked her face, a rapid total assessment, 3 seconds, and then straightened and looked at the man with an expression that had no temperature at all. Adriana crossed to Mrs. O, touched her arm once, briefly. The housekeeper exhaled in a controlled shudder and held herself together. "You've made your point," Jiheon said. His voice was very even, the specific evenness of something with enormous pressure behind it. "Mr. Ryu felt it was important that you understand the nature of the arrangement he's proposing," the man said. "A renegotiation of the Western Corridor terms. Given the current circumstances, he believes a more equitable division." "You're in my grandmother's house at 11 p.m., Jiheon's voice was still even. "There is no version of this conversation that ends with a renegotiation." The man looked at him. Mr. Ryu anticipated this response. He asked me to be clear that the current arrangement— "Get out." The 2 words landed with the specific quality of something that didn't need volume to cut through everything else in the room. The man paused. He looked at the 2 others, a rapid confirmation check. Then at Adriana. Then back at Jiheon. "Mr. Kang, if you're unable to approach this practically, I want you to look at this room," Jiheon said, still quiet. "I want you to look at what you came into tonight and understand that you have crossed a line that cannot be relocated. Whatever Ryu told you this visit would accomplish, a demonstration, a negotiation, a show of access, he miscalculated completely." The man's composure was professional but not infinite. A fraction of uncertainty moved across his face. "The conversation about the Western Corridor is finished," Jiheon continued. "The arrangement Ryu wants doesn't exist and will not exist. What does exist as of tomorrow morning is a situation where Ryu answers to every relationship he has for what happened in this house tonight." He paused. "You know who Chairman Baek is?" A beat. "You know what a call from Baek to the 3 contacts Ryu approached today means for Ryu's position?" Another beat. "You know what happens when a man is seen to move against an old woman in her home in this city?" The man said nothing. "He sent you here to show me he could reach her," Jiheon said. "I need you to go back to him with a different message. Tell him he showed me exactly what he's willing to do, and that what he's willing to do is the last card he had, and he played it tonight, and it didn't work." The room was absolutely still. The water feature outside continued its absurd, steady sound. Hana, in her chair, had not moved, had not spoken. Was looking at Jiheon with the specific expression of a woman who had raised him and was watching him be, in this moment, exactly what she had always known he could be. Not the monster the city feared, but the man underneath the monster, who had a line he wouldn't cross, and had found it in this room tonight. The 3rd man looked at the other 2. Another rapid consultation, decision tree running in real time. Then he straightened. "Mr. Ryu will want a direct response," he said. "He'll have one," Jiheon said. "Not through you." The 3 men left, not quickly, with the managed pace of people determined to exit on their own terms rather than in retreat. But they left, through the open door and across the courtyard, and through the gate that was still 3 inches open, and she heard the badly parked cars start and pull away. And then the street was quiet. Mrs. O made a sound that was not quite a sob and entirely understandable. Adriana turned to Hana. The old woman was looking at her, not at Jiheon, at Adriana, with those clear, direct eyes that didn't soften things and didn't need to. "Sit down," Hana said. "Both of you. Mrs. O, tea sam." They stayed 2 hours. Mrs. O made tea and then made it again. The second pot, the specific act of a woman reestablishing domestic normalcy over the shattered glass of the last hour, and Adriana drank both cups and felt the adrenaline recede in layers. The immediate physical tension first, then the operational focus, and last, slow and deep like a tide pulling back. The emotional weight of what the night had been. Hana talked about Jiheon as a boy, arriving at her house after his parents died, angry and closed, and so frightened beneath the anger that she'd sometimes stood outside his bedroom door at night just to hear him breathe and confirm he was still there. About the years she'd spent watching him build an empire from the ruins of a childhood that had taught him the world was violent, and that the only response to violence was to become something the violence couldn't touch. I was afraid, Hana said, that he would forget what he was building it for. She wasn't looking at Jiheon when she said it. She was looking at Adriana. And then he brought someone home, Hana continued, who remembered for him. Adriana looked at her hands around the teacup, the burn scar, the hangnail, finally dealt with 3 weeks ago. I didn't come here for that reason, she said honestly. I know. Hana's voice was dry with the specific dryness of someone who had lived long enough that the distinction barely mattered. The reasons we arrive somewhere and the reasons we stay are rarely the same thing. Jiheon, beside Adriana, said nothing. He was looking at his grandmother with the concentrated attention of a man memorizing a face, the same way he'd done in the hospital, and she felt the grief in it alongside the gratitude, the two things occupying the same space without canceling each other out. At 1 a.m, Hana's eyes started to close with the specific heaviness of a body that had been through too much in one night and needed to rest. Mrs. O helped her to her room. At the doorway, Hana stopped and turned and looked at both of them one more time. The divorce papers, she said, to no one in particular. Don't sign them. Then she went to bed. Mwah. Outside in the courtyard, Jiheon stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the stone water feature still doing its steady work in the dark. Adriana stood beside him. The city beyond the courtyard walls was quiet at this hour, the specific quiet of a city that never fully silenced but dropped to its lowest register around 1 a.m. Not peaceful exactly, but resting. Ryu, she said, what happens tomorrow? I make 2 calls before 8 a.m., he said. Baek is one. The other is a man in Busan who has been watching Ryu's expansion with significant personal concern for 18 months. Together, those calls create a pressure framework that makes any further move from Ryu public, visible, and professionally catastrophic. He looked at the water. He'll retreat, not because he wants to, because the cost of not retreating exceeds any gain he can calculate from continuing. You've been building toward this for weeks. Since Tuesday. Since I understood the shape of what he was doing. He paused. The Western Corridor moved 6 months ago. I told myself it was clean, within the agreed terms. It was. Technically. Another pause. But I knew how Ryu would read it. I knew, and I moved anyway because the opportunity was significant, and I told myself I could manage the response. She looked at him. I pulled you into a situation that was already in motion, he said, before the hallway, before the contract. The instability Ryu tried to weaponize tonight. I made it. My grandmother, Do-hyun, the exposure, all of it flows from a decision I made 6 months ago that I justified too quickly and examined too slowly. The courtyard was very still. I know, she said. He looked at her. I've known since Do-hyun, she said. The shape of it. She held his gaze. You're not telling me anything I hadn't figured out. And I'm still here. The words were simple. They didn't reach for anything. They were just true, stated in the quiet courtyard at 1 a.m. after a night that had cost them both something they hadn't budgeted for, and they landed with the weight of things said without strategy. He looked at her for a long moment. Adriana, he said. The way he'd said her name in the corridor that first night, with weight. Different weight now. The weight had a name it didn't have then. She could hear it in the way he said the word. I know, she said, again, softer. I need to say it. I know that too. He exhaled, just slightly, the specific exhale of a man setting down something he'd been carrying for longer than he'd admitted. I love you, he said. That's not the contract. That's not the situation. That's been building since before the hallway, and I've been refusing to name it because naming it made it real, and making it real meant I had something to lose, and I have spent 20 years making sure I didn't have things I couldn't afford to lose. She looked at him. I'm done refusing to name it, he said, whatever that costs. The water feature ran its steady sound in the dark. She thought about a flickering corridor and a legal document and an old woman's hand and 7 weeks of the most complicated, costly, bone-deep real experience she'd had since she left Lagos with a plan and a determination and shoes that didn't fit. She thought about Chisum's voice on the phone. Are you okay? And the answer she'd given that had been true then and was truer now in a way Chisum would probably find simultaneously alarming and unsurprising. She thought about her father, Tabena Okoye, who had buried a clause in his will about marriage with the specific stubbornness of a man who believed that the right structure could protect the people he loved even after he was gone to protect them himself. Who had been wrong about almost everything except, possibly, accidentally, this. I know, she said. The third time. Different meaning. She stepped toward him. I've known for a while. He pulled her in and held on, and she felt the full weight of him. Not the managed version, not the operational version, but the actual person, tired and relieved and frightened and present, and she held back with everything she had and let the courtyard be quiet around them. The calls were made before 8 a.m. She was there for both of them, not in the room, but in the penthouse, or drinking coffee at the kitchen window while Jiheon's voice came from the study in the controlled cadences of a man managing consequences. She heard the tone rather than the words and understood the shape of them, deliberate, precise, the kind of conversation that moved things into place without requiring drama because the information itself was the drama. When he came back to the kitchen, his face was settled. The tightness that had been there since Tuesday of the first week, the managed residue of a situation in motion, was gone. Not replaced by ease exactly, but by the specific stillness of a man whose pieces were where he put them. Beck, she said, supportive, explicitly. He poured coffee. The Busan contact, his name is Chairman O, no relation to Mrs. O, was already aware of Ryu's western corridor positioning. He's been looking for an alignment point for months. Last night's move gave him everything he needed. Ryu's isolated. He'll make noise, Jiheon said. Men like Ryu always make noise when they're cornered, but the noise will be expensive for him and free for us. He sat across from her. It's over. She looked at him. Are you sure? In this business, you're never completely sure, he said, but I'm sure enough that I can tell you without managing the answer. She nodded. He looked at her over his coffee. I want to talk about the contract. I know. Han has the paperwork. The divorce filing has an activation date in 6 weeks. He set his cup down. I want to withdraw it. She looked at him steadily. You're asking me to stay married. I'm asking you to choose it. Actually choose it. Not the contract version, the real version. Whatever that looks like. Whatever pace you need. Whatever you need it to be. He held her eyes. I'm not asking you to become something the city expects Kang Jiheon's wife to be. I'm asking you to be what you already are, which is exactly what you are, and to let me be in your life while you're being it. She absorbed this. She thought about the Nigerian-Korean fusion restaurant she'd been designing in her head for 2 years, the menu she'd built mentally during bad shifts, the specific neighborhood near Itaewon where the rent was possible and the foot traffic was right, the name she'd decided on at 3 a.m. once and forgotten and rediscovered 6 weeks later in the Notes app on her phone. She thought about her sisters, Chisum's voice, the house in Lagos that was now safe, the land in Enugu that Emeka couldn't touch, the twins growing, their school fees paid, their futures intact. She thought about Hana saying, don't sign them from a doorway at 1 a.m. with the absolute authority of a woman who knew exactly what she was saying. She thought about the practical section of her chest, which was gone entirely now, replaced by something that didn't have a clean name, but was considerably heavier and warmer and more real. I want to open a restaurant, she said. He looked at her. A real one. Mine. Not a position in yours or a favor from your network. My own capital, my own concept, my own name on the lease. She held his gaze. I'll need time and I'll need to keep working at Gumong until the capital is right, and I will not be doing this on your timeline or with your money. I wouldn't expect otherwise. And I want to go home first, she said. Lagos. Before anything else gets decided. I need to go home and see my sisters, and walk through my father's house and understand what it means that it's still there. Of course. And I need you to understand that I am not becoming a different person because of this. I'm not going to stop having opinions or saying them or pushing back on your decisions when your decisions are wrong. That is not a temporary state. That is me. I know, he said. The third time. The same weight she'd put in it the night before returned. She looked at him. She thought about a night 7 weeks ago, standing in the rain and the dark, and the absolute desperate simplicity of having nothing left but bad options. She thought about how it felt to be cornered so completely that the only move was the one you'd never have considered in the open. She thought about what came through the impossible door. "Okay," she said. "Tell Han to withdraw the filing." Jiheon sat very still for a moment, the specific stillness of someone absorbing something they've been afraid of not having. And then he nodded once, and she saw the thing that moved through his face, and she let herself see it without filing it anywhere. She flew to Lagos 2 weeks later. Chisholm met her at the airport in a state of restrained emotional chaos that expressed itself as 2 minutes of very tight hugging and then a barrage of questions delivered so rapidly in the car that Adriana answered 3 of them simultaneously, and they both started laughing before she'd finished the second sentence. The house was the same. That was the thing that hit her when they pulled up. Not the size of it, not the specific details, but the sameness. Her father's house in Lagos was exactly itself. The gate with the rust on the lower hinge. The bougainvillea that had been threatening to swallow the front wall since she was 12 and still hadn't managed it. The sound of the city behind it, different from Seoul's sound. Warmer, denser. The specific frequency of a place that had been home before she knew home was a thing you could lose. She stood at the gate and breathed it in for a long moment. Ngozi came out of the front door before she reached it, and the twins were behind her. And the next 20 minutes were the specific, beautiful chaos of a family that loved each other imperfectly and continuously. And Adriana sat in the middle of it and felt something unknot in her chest that she hadn't fully known was knotted. That night, after the twins were asleep, and Ngozi and Chisholm were in the kitchen doing the specific late-night talking that sisters did when they had things to say that required the cover of domesticity, Adriana went to her father's study. It was as he'd left it. She and her sisters had agreed after the funeral to leave it for a while. 2 years later, still left. The desk, the journals, the reading glasses on their folded arms beside the lamp. The slight smell of the specific tea he'd drunk every evening. A blend from a shop that had been 2 streets over and was probably still there. She sat in his chair. She thought about a man who had loved his daughters enough to try to protect them from the grave, using the tools of his generation, the structures his own father had built. Conditional, imperfect, wrong in the way that loving people were often wrong when they tried to manage the futures of people who hadn't been born yet. She thought about what the clause had cost her and what it had given her, and the absolute impossibility of separating those 2 things. "You didn't know," she said, to the study, to the glasses, to the ghost of an evening tea smell. "You were trying." She paused. "It worked. Badly and accidentally and in ways you couldn't have planned, but it worked." The house settled around her in the way old houses did, creaking, breathing, full of its accumulated life. She sat for a while longer. Then she went back to the kitchen where her sisters were talking. She called Jiheon from the rooftop that night. Lagos after midnight. The city's sounds below. Motorbikes. Generators. Distant music. The specific nocturnal texture of a city that didn't entirely sleep. The sky was different here. Wider and darker. The stars more present than Seoul's light-crowded sky allowed. He answered on the second ring, which she'd started to understand was simply how he was. The phone always close, the attention always available when it was her. "How is it?" he said. "Exactly the same," she said. "Everything exactly the same." "Is that good?" "Yes." She looked at the sky. "Yes, it's good." He was quiet for a moment. She could hear Seoul in the background of his call. The distant city noise, the specific frequency of the Han River district that she'd internalized without noticing. "Hana had a good day," he said. "She sat in the courtyard for an hour this morning. She asked Mrs. O to plant something new. Apparently the plant selection was insufficient." She laughed. "What did she want?" "Jasmine. 3 different varieties. Mrs. O is researching." "Tell her I'll help choose when I'm back." "She'll tell you you have no idea what you're talking about, and then take your suggestion." "I know," she said. "That's why I offered." He made a sound that was from Kang Jiheon, the functional equivalent of laughing. She'd learned to read the register of it. "The restaurant," she said. "I found a possible space near Itaewon. I've been looking at the numbers." Tell me. She told him. The square footage, the rent structure, the renovation estimate she'd worked out on paper on the flight over. The menu she'd been building in her head for 2 years that was, it turned out, ready to be written down. She talked for 20 minutes, and he listened the way he listened. Completely, without interruption, the focused attention that had once felt like assessment and now felt like what it actually was, which was someone who wanted to understand what she was building. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The location is right, he said. I know. The timeline is aggressive. I know that too. You'll make it work anyway. Obviously, she said. He was quiet again. Then, come home soon. She looked at the Lagos sky, the stars, the city below. She thought about the word home and all the places it had lived in her life. This city, this house, Seoul's enormous indifference, a service corridor with a flickering light, a hospital room at 3 a.m., a courtyard with a water feature and jasmine coming. Soon, she said. Quote, she was back in Seoul in 10 days. The restaurant happened over the following 5 months with the specific energy of a thing that had been waiting long enough that once it started, it moved fast. She kept her gumong shifts through the first 3, negotiated the lease on the Itaewon space herself, stood in the empty room with its high ceilings and its south-facing windows and its smell of old plaster and possibility, and understood that she had been building toward this since before she knew she was building toward it. The concept was exactly what she'd designed in her head. Nigerian-Korean fusion, the specific meeting point of the 2 places that had made her who she was. Nothing that apologized for either tradition or tried to merge them into something palatable for an audience that couldn't decide. Her food, her terms, her kitchen running on the specific logic of a woman who had spent 14 months learning the standards of one of Seoul's best restaurants and 26 years learning that the best cooking came from knowing exactly who you were while you were doing it. She named it koe, the Yoruba word for learn or to teach, depending on the construction. Chisholm flew in for the opening. Jiheon sat in the corner booth, her corner booth, the one she'd designated for him from the beginning, the joke and the truth of it sitting in the same space, and ate everything she sent out and said nothing while he ate, which was the version of a review she trusted most. Afterward, when the last guests had left and the kitchen was being closed down and Chisholm was in animated conversation with the sous chef about the agusi preparation, Jiheon sat at the corner booth with a glass of water and looked at Adriana moving through the closing tasks of her restaurant, and she caught him looking and held it. Well, she said. It's exactly what you said it would be, he said. You doubted it. I didn't doubt it for a second, he said. I just wanted to see it be real. He paused. It's real. She looked at her restaurant, her kitchen, the specific light she'd chosen for the corner booth and the way it fell across the table, the smell of the place, spices and citrus, and the particular warmth of a room that had just spent its first evening being what it was built to be. It's real, she agreed. Kang Hana died in March. On a Tuesday morning, in her own bed, in her own house, with Jiheon on one side and Adriana on the other, and Mrs. O in the doorway, and the sound of the courtyard's water feature coming faintly through the paper screens. She had been declining since January, the specific decline of someone ready rather than failing, the deliberate self-possessed quality of a woman who had always made her own decisions and was making this one the same way. She had spent February asking people to bring her things from around the house, a photograph, a teacup, a small piece of cloth from something Adriana didn't know the history of, and holding them and setting them down and seeming satisfied in a way that was not sad, but completed. The last week she talked more than she had in months, to Mrs. O about the jasmine, which had taken and was doing well, to Jiheon about things Adriana couldn't follow in Korean, but whose tone she understood as the specific tone of accounts being settled, not debts, but the record of a shared history being acknowledged out loud before the opportunity closed. To Adriana, on the last full day, in English, with the careful deliberateness of someone choosing to say something in a language that required effort, because the effort was part of the meaning. You changed the direction of something, Hana said, not because you tried to, because you didn't. Adriana sat with that. I didn't try to change anything, she said honestly. That's what I mean. Hana's eyes were clear and direct as they had always been. People who try to change things push. You just stood in your own place, and everything arranged itself around where you were standing. She held Adriana's hand for a while after that without speaking, and Adriana held back, and the room was quiet, and the jasmine outside was coming in through the window on a cold March air, and it was enough. The morning she died was the same. Quiet, complete, unremarkable, in the way that things that have been fully lived were unremarkable at their ending. Jiheon held his grandmother's hand until it stilled, and then he sat for a long time afterward, not moving, and Adriana sat beside him and didn't fill the silence with anything, because silence was what the moment was, and filling it would have been a form of cowardice. He cried once, briefly, turned away, then turned back, and she didn't look away from him, and he let her not look away. That was what it was. Boom. There was a letter. Han had it. Hana had given it to him 3 months before, with instructions for timing. He delivered it on the morning of the 4th day after the funeral, when the house was quiet again and the jasmine was still growing, and Mrs. O had made tea, and the specific rawness of the immediate grief had settled into the longer, slower weight of actual loss. The envelope had Adriana's name on it. She opened it at the kitchen table in the penthouse. Jiheon beside her, early light coming through the windows. Hana's handwriting was careful and slightly uneven. The handwriting of someone writing in a language that was not their first, making the effort because it mattered. There were 3 sentences. He needed someone who would stay in the room. You stayed. Thank you for that. She read it twice. Then she set it on the table and looked at the city through the window. The enormous, indifferent city that had never cared about any of this and had been the container for all of it anyway. The streets and the lights and the river and the specific gray-blue Seoul sky that she had learned over 2 years to find beautiful in its own particular way. Jiheon's hand found hers on the table. She turned her hand over and held on. The city went on. The jasmine grew. The restaurant opened and filled and became what she'd built it to be. Her sisters called and grew and continued their lives on the other side of the world that was also hers. The work of being 2 people who had found each other by accident in a flickering corridor and then chosen each other, clearly and with full information, went on being the specific daily work that it was. Imperfect, unguarded, real. On the first anniversary of the night in the hallway, she closed the restaurant early and they went back to Gumong. Private dining room 3. The room was the same. The same walls, the same amber lighting, the same quality of expensive quiet. She sat in the chair where she'd sat the night she'd signed a contract that turned out to be the worst-kept document either of them had ever agreed to. And he sat across from her, and she served him the dinner she'd cooked herself in Gumong's kitchen, the way she'd cooked at the very beginning, and he ate every bite the way he always ate her food, with his full attention, like a man who understood exactly what he was being given and had stopped pretending he didn't want it. Afterward, he put a single folded piece of paper on the table between them. She looked at it. Han kept a copy, Jiheon said, of the original contract. I asked him for it. She looked at the paper, then at him. He put his lighter on the table beside it. She picked up the paper, unfolded it, read the first paragraph, the clean legal language of a transaction, a 6-month agreement between 2 people who needed specific things and had been willing to pay specific prices for them, and then folded it back along its original creases. She picked up the lighter. He watched her. She clicked it open. The contract caught at the corner first, the flame moving through the paper with the specific unhurried efficiency of fire, and she held it over the small plate between them and watched it burn down through all the careful language and the term, dates and the exit clauses and the financial provisions, until what was left was ash and the smell of it in the quiet dining room. She set the plate down. She looked at him across the table. No more contracts, she said. He looked at her with that face, the open version, the one she'd been the first person in years to see, the one that had belonged to her since a hospital room at 3 a.m. when he'd held her hand in the dark and she'd finally stopped filing anything away. No more contracts, he said. Outside, Seoul ran on through its night. The Han River caught the city's light the way it always did. The streets moved with the specific energy of a city that had no opinion about any individual life but held them all the same, enormous and indifferent and endlessly, indifferently alive. Inside private dining room 3, The ash cooled on the plate, and Kang Jiheon reached across the table, and Adriana Okoye took his hand. And that was enough. That was everything.